Not really. So I'm working in, I guess you'd say, cognitive neuroscience, and focused on language or models of semantic memory. So I sort of at the intersection of machine learning and neuroscience.
Cool. Are you doing work in that field? Like, are you on your
Sorry.
dissertation already?
Yeah, well, it's early days, but that is what I'm doing.
Cool. What is your dissertation on?
Hmm. Well, what I'm planning to work on is to test models that have been. But basically, there's a lot of models from the machine learning literature about how language works and how we form representations of words and string those into sentences. And however, these we don't really know to what extent these actually relate to how human brains actually work. So I'm interested in trying to test some of these models and maybe get some insight from behavioral and neuroimaging data to try to um, see whether these models are any use or not, or whether they're just sort of doing their own thing.
Yeah, how would you like map the models onto some kind of neurological correlates? Because it seems like most of them are pretty abstract.
Sorry, I've got a bit of feedback in my headphones. Just a
Oh
second.
yeah,
I don't know what that is.
must
Anyway,
be.
well, there are different ways of doing that. Probably the simplest way is to compare the representations. So the models will form representations of different words or sentences as like a pattern of activations, right? And you can compare that to, if you're using brain data, you can compare that to patterns of activations that are measured like using fMRI. That's one method that's been developed that I'm pretty interested in. But I mean, you are right that there are many ways of making the comparison, and that's part of the difficulty. That in fact, that's what I've been finding, that different studies can make the comparison differently. So it's actually very difficult to sort of find consistent methods, which is a problem.
And does that get into like the super philosophical things, like the Chinese room? Like, what is really meaning? How do you
Hmm.
attribute language to what is in the brain anyway?
It can, yes. Some papers talk more about this than others. Um, yeah, so I guess in terms of the Chinese room argument, that's brought up in some of the papers. I think that the current models are trying to provide a reductive explanation of meaning in terms of like word vectors and things like that. Um, I think the idea would be, well, the idea implicit in these models is that if you could build a cognitive system with a good enough set of these representations that was appropriately grounded, like in perception and things, then it would understand language. Um, I don't know exactly what what's his name, John Searle would say about that. I suspect he's would be pretty suspicious of these attempts. But I would say that the Chinese room argument per se relies on the idea of just a huge lookup table, and that's not what these models are supposed to be doing. It's not like you just look up what the response should be. Um, so, in my opinion, John Searle's argument um, is useful for applying to some versions of computationalism, which just say that it's just about the inputs and the outputs. So you can understand language if you just produce the right outputs. You know, when someone says something, you produce a meaningful, an appropriate response. I think that that's a fair criticism, but I don't think it applies to like any computational approach to language, because I think the idea would be, well, it sort of depends on how you perform those computations. Um, a sufficiently enriched cognitive architecture with the right set of embeddings, I think, would plausibly understand language. Um, but we don't know because we haven't got that yet. So like, it's a yeah that is an active question
How would that
or an open
be
question.
different from the Chinese room? Because essentially he's just using all possible variations of computation to mean finding the correct answer. So how would you say that a sufficiently complicated computational system would be able to have meaning in that context?
Well, John Searle, at least as I understand the original formulation, is he's talking about understanding, and he just sort of says that, or is relying on an intuition that someone in a room using a lookup table wouldn't understand Chinese. And I mean, I share the intuition, and I think that that's definitely getting at something there. If we now change the experiment and now imagine that we have, well, I'm not exactly sure how you change it, because you'd have to have a cognitive system with a set of embeddings that are grounded in an appropriate way. It just looks more and more like a person, essentially, or at least how we think that a person works. So, at least for me, the intuition is just much weakened when you're talking about that. Like, I just think that that is kind of what we do when we understand words. Like, there's a set of activations in our brain, which relates in some ways to like perception. When someone uses a word, you sort of have a dim activations of what it looks like and maybe smells like, and memories of using it, and that's just kind of what it is to understand language. So the more we could replicate that artificially, the more it seems like, well, plausibly that's just what it is, to understand language. So I guess it comes down to, how do you have the intuition that, well, that system still wouldn't understand language? Because I don't in that case, and I think that the Chinese room experiment really, or thought experiment really, does rely on that intuition that it just doesn't understand, because there's no real argument there. He's just sort of presenting the force of the situation and saying, well, look, clearly a lookup table wouldn't understand. And I'm saying, well, okay, a lookup table might not, but I don't know that any computational system wouldn't be able to understand, depending on how it's designed.
What do you mean by embedded in an appropriate way?
Yeah, so I'm being a bit vague here, trying to avoid the technical details. So when I say embedding, that's what these algorithms do. Is they take like a word or a sentence and basically turn it into a list of numbers, or a vector of numbers, and that's called an embedding. That's a way to represent the meaning of the word or sentence. And so these models, like some people might have heard of GPT-3, which is one of the latest, biggest ones. Um, you know, they can perform a wide range of tasks, and produce very natural sounding text. But we don't really think that these models actually understand the text. We're still a long ways off from that. But the idea is that, or at least the idea of people in this area, including myself, is that um, these models are a starting point for understanding how meaning and language is actually represented in the brain. So plausibly, when we understand a word, or when we think about a word or a concept, um, there's a bunch of neurons firing in a certain way, and you could think of that as like a pattern of activation that you could represent using a vector of numbers. Maybe the numbers would change over time, as like if it's a dynamic concept like movement or something. But so what we try to do with the models is um, find a way to um, represent these patterns of activity using a simplified artificial representation. And the better we got at that, the more it would kind of represent what's actually happening in the brain. And so that's what I mean by a good set of embeddings. Essentially, just representing the neural activity with a set of numbers. And presumably, it wouldn't have to be like one to one. If it was sort of close enough, then we'd get better at representing what is going on.
Wouldn't that just be substituting the Chinese letters for the neural activity, and essentially instead of replacing the Chinese letters with the correct outputs, you're just replacing the neural activity with the correct outputs?
Well, yeah. So Searle might make an argument like that. I'm not sure, and one could. At that point, I would say, well, I don't really share the intuition that no sort of cognitive system like that would understand, because I mean, I just think that that is what humans are doing, just at a very sophisticated level. I think the point of the lookup table is that you can perform that task uh, any um, without any of the things that we think are sort of distinctively human, like ability, I don't know, like imagination or insight, or ability to draw connections. It's purely mechanical in a very simplistic way. It's like you just find the phrase and then you repeat what it says in the huge book. That, at least to me, that's where the intuition comes from. And even current language models aren't like that, and they're still quite crude. Like, and I don't think that that's certainly not the type of model that I'm interested in looking at. And no one's working on models like that, because I mean, we know human language can't work like that for one reason, that it is productive. That is, you can never have a book that was big enough, because there's an infinite that there's no limit on the length of sentences or the variety of combinations that you can make. So there has to be more than just a lookup table. Like, it's physically impossible to fit that into your head. Um, so like, we know that that's wrong, right? So the question is, if we had a better model of what's actually happening in human brains, could we represent that in computational terms, and then would that model replicate understanding? And I think it plausibly would, if it was sophisticated enough. But we're still at early days of that, so I'm not claiming that current models are like can understand. Um, I'm saying that give us another 50 years and maybe they'll be understand.
Yeah. So would you disagree with the conclusion that mental processes are purely computational, and say, yeah, they probably are purely computational in just some more advanced way that we don't understand yet?
I think the short answer would be, yeah, I'd agree with that. But the longer answer is I'm becoming to think that the notion of computation is sometimes overblown. I mean, it depends sort of the context because I don't think that there's a fact of the matter about whether some process is computational or not. I think that that's a model that we apply to things. So this is an argument. Well, this is related to a point that John Searles made. He says that look at a bunch of atoms on the wall. You can describe their various movements and jigglings using input and output relations if you want, and you can define some weird arbitrary function of that. And so you can say that the paint on my wall is computing something. But that's sort of trivial and uninteresting and not relevant for understanding its function in any way. But it is computation. Like computation just requires inputs and outputs in a functional relation, right? So in that sense, I think whether something is performing a computation is largely just a question of how we apply that label to it, or whether we find that formalism helpful in understanding a system. Many physical systems can be described in computational terms. Some we haven't really figured out how to do that yet. So I think that computational formalisms are very useful and will be very useful in explicating how cognition works. And so in that sense, you can use your shorthand and say, yeah, the brain is performing computations. But I think we have to be careful there, and because I don't think the notion of computation actually does that much philosophical work if you like push really far down into it, because of the sort of triviality issue that like almost everything can be said to be computing if you just depending on how you define the inputs and outputs. But I think a more sophisticated way of saying that is that the functions that you could use to describe what the brain is doing, like cognitively, are very important for the operation of the system in terms of its biological function. So I could define, arbitrary functions to relate, I don't know, cells in my liver or something. And that may not be helpful for explicating how they, purify the blood or whatever. But in terms of if you find a good set of functions that can describe what the brain is doing cognitively, I think that is actually very important for their biological function, which is processing inputs in terms of like sensory apparatus and then producing outputs in terms of behaviors. So I think that it's more relevant and useful to describe cognition computationally than arbitrary cases that you could come up with.
Do you think the problem is mostly just because of the ambiguity to the term computation?
I wouldn't say ambiguity because it has a fairly precise definition. It's more like it's so broad. So a computation is sort of any like a computation is computing the output of a function, and a function is just a relation between inputs and outputs that's one way, right? So that is almost universal, or can be universal.
So what would be, since that definition is so broad, what would not be a computation in that sense? Could anything not be?
Right. Well, that's the issue. I mean, so classically, you define a computation as any process that has any process that can be performed using purely mechanical means, like a pencil and paper is sort of the classic Turing definition that he gave, in a finite number of steps to reach a definitive answer. So, for example, I think truly random processes couldn't be described as computations, at least as classically. So, like, if you think that collapsing a wave function is a truly random process, then that couldn't be defined computationally, at least as I understand it. If you believe that there are non-physical entities in reality, then plausibly, like the actions of a libertarian agent couldn't be described computationally. At least I wouldn't think so, but I'm not sure exactly. So maybe there are some things, but I mean, and there are some things that cannot be that have no algorithms for solving them, like the halting problem. But that's a bit of a different question than like in terms of a physical process. There is a theory, I think it's like digital physics, which says that essentially everything in the universe is computable. So it may be the case that everything that exists is in some sense can be described using computation. So there's a bit of background noise. We've got a bit of cleaning going on here.
No problem. It's not really noticeable on my end. But yeah, so from my understanding, even if there was a supernatural realm, I don't know about libertarian free will because I don't even understand what that would mean for it to even to exist. But it seems like even if there was a supernatural realm, that would also count as computation. I definitely agree with the randomness thing, but I also don't really understand randomness. Do you think there is such a thing as true randomness?
Yeah, I sort of lean to thinking that there may be, just because of my preferred interpretation of quantum mechanics. Objective collapse theories postulate that there is true randomness in there, but not because I particularly love of that idea. It's just that I think it's better than other interpretations for various reasons, which we needn't get into here. But I mean, it's very complicated stuff. But in terms of libertarian agents, I think that, yeah, look, I don't know. I think the idea of libertarian agency is pretty tricky to make concrete. I just don't think that you can, as I understand it, the idea of libertarian agency is that the agent is the ultimate cause of its behaviors or decisions.
Causa sui.
So I don't, yeah, and I don't know that there could be anything that, like, you could say you could work through a process of steps to compute what it would do. It feels like that decision just has to be caused directly by the agent with no sort of steps or process that intermediates it. It's not like you could assign. I mean, I guess you could assign inputs as, I don't know, the set of material circumstances that are relevant. The output is just whatever it does. But then the thing is, I don't think that there's going to be a function there, right? Not in terms of like future behavior, because the idea of libertarian agency, right, is in the exact same material circumstances, you could choose to do this or that. So I don't think there's anything, like, it seems there's no output to the function. It's not defined until it happens. So I guess you could assign past behaviors to a function if you wanted to, but I don't think until it happens, there's any fact of the matter there. Whereas in a physicalist world, you've got like, well, there is a determinate randomness aside. There's a determinate output. Atoms jiggle in this way, and then they'll produce this output, right? Whereas libertarian agency says, no, it's just generated by the agent. I don't know. At least it seems to me it's hard to fit into that formula, but maybe someone's done it somewhere. I don't know.
Would you even find that as a coherent concept, like the idea that you can have this causa sui just idea or decision that just magically appears in your brain without any kind of precursor? Because to me, it seems like it's got to be determined or random. It's got to be one of those two. So the idea that there's some third thing out there that you can cause them yourself I don't find that coherent. I don't understand what that even means.
I definitely don't think it makes sense if you say that it somehow affects your brain. That's the interaction problem, right? If we completely abstract that away and say, look, it's just an immaterial soul and it has no physical manifestation. I mean, I don't think it's possible. I think it's a coherent idea. Basically, it's just saying there's a special type of causation that happens when there's an immaterial soul and it sort of just generates its own decisions. I mean, you can say that, right? I don't think there's any contradiction there. It's just, it seems extremely unlike anything that we otherwise know, and particularly difficult to fit into the physical world. Because then if you think that it interacts with the physical world in some way, then you have to have this explanation for how non-physical can interact with the physical. And I think that is an extremely problematic idea. So many of the people who are substance dualists will want to say that there is this sort of interaction. Not everyone. There are people who say that they're just their own parallel things, and so there's no interaction. At that point, I would say, well, that seems to be just a profligate ontology. Like, why do you need this extra stuff? But in terms of the interaction idea, which I know that there are a bunch of Christian apologists who are still arguing for this, and I've critiqued them. I think that idea is pretty much, I mean, it's about as disconfirmed by science as it can ever be. I mean, you can still say that it's high,
all of the same predictions are made under idealism and dualism, right? You can't disprove it.
Yeah, idealism is sort of its own thing, but interactionist dualism, which takes the physical world to exist but exists separately from the non-physical world, and then there's this special type of causation that somehow affects both. Yeah, I think that's a really problematic notion.
Well, for me, even if we grant that there is the supernatural realm and it can somehow has this magic ability to generate its own ideas, it seems like that's also either got to be determined or random. Like, if there's literally no precursor cause to this generation of this idea, then it seems by definition just pure randomness, which would then contradict the libertarian idea.
Yeah. Well, I think this is an interesting point, and I want to think more about this as well, because I feel like dualists think that they understand this idea of ancient causation better than I think that I understand it. And so maybe they're onto something, at least in terms of, I don't think they're onto something in terms of it's correct, but maybe at least the idea makes more sense than I think it does. So as I understand it, what they're saying is that there is a special type of causation, or at least there may be multiple types, right? Which involves an agent, an immaterial agent causing its choices or behaviors, right? Let's say choices, because that doesn't involve like any physical necessary. And so they just say that that's just how it is. Like, there's no further explanation to how that happens. They just say that that's just how it works. So I don't think that in itself that is a contradictory idea. They're not going to say there's no explanation. They're going to say there is an explanation. The explanation is the agent made that choice. And if you say, but why did they make that choice and not a different choice? They'll just say, well, that doesn't have an explanation. That's just a brute fact, essentially. And at that point, I think you've just bottomed out. Now, I think that that's a bad ontology to have because it leaves you with essentially arbitrarily many brute facts for every time any agent makes a decision. You've got a brute fact there. And I don't think that that is a very satisfactory explanation if you can avoid those brute facts by postulating, say, causal relations. But I don't think that it's a contradictory. Like I don't think it has to be random or causally, like physically determined. You can postulate that there's this special type of causation which just is its own thing. Like you can always postulate something like that. I just think that the question is how plausible is that going to be given our other commitments?
Sure. Anyway, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling the audience a little bit about yourself before we get started?
I thought we were starting.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah. So I'm James. I am doing a PhD in neuroscience, working on, I guess we've just been talking about sort of language models and cognition and understanding how humans understand things. I have been active in kind of, I guess, philosophy, counter-apologetics on YouTube for, I don't know, a bit over a year now. I've written a book called Unreasonable Faith, which critiques William Lane Craig's apologetics. So my interest in this goes back a fair ways. Originally, I was raised as a Mormon, so I left that when I was around 20 and have since become an atheist. And so I now call myself an atheist and a naturalist, and I am interested in trying to promote critical thinking, scientifically based reasoning, and just generally dialogue across worldviews and thinking more carefully and critically about what we think. So that's sort of what I do or try to do.
Cool. Did you publish your book, self-publish it, or did you get a publisher?
No, it's a small. Let me grab it here. It's a small UK publisher called where is it? The Hypatia Press.
Nice.
Which you can look up. I realize it doesn't actually say the full name there. Oh yeah, here it is on the back. Which may be flipped, but yeah, look that up if you're interested. It's the first, to my knowledge, and I'm pretty sure this is true, book-length critique of William Lane Craig's sort of entire apologetic, which is why I wrote it, because I thought surely someone's done this, how prolific Craig is. But no, people have written bits and pieces, but not a sort of a single book on it. So that is a useful resource. So check that out if you're interested.
Cool. What is your response to the Grim Reaper paradox and the no past infinites thing?
Oh, Grim Reaper paradox. So Craig doesn't actually use the Grim Reaper paradox as an argument against the possibility of an infinite past, because the Grim Reaper paradox requires there to be it requires time to be infinitesimally divisible into arbitrarily small increments, like the real numbers. Like there's no kind of smallest unit of distance between them, and Craig rejects that. So he does mention the Grim Reaper paradox in his work, but he actually uses it as an argument against the possibility for time to be divided that way, which is an interesting objection that you can actually use against the Grim Reaper paradox for those who do deploy it against the possibility of an infinite past. You can just say, actually, like Craig does, well, all this shows is that time is not infinitesimally divisible, that there must be something else, like a smallest unit of time or something like that. Now, I mean, that's not my personal response, but it is a response that you can make. And I think it's interesting to note that Craig actually uses it that way.
What is your personal response to it?
Well, for those who use it to argue against the possibility of a past infinite, let's see. So I do talk about this in my book as well. For what, but yeah, Craig uses it in a slightly different way, but he does mention it. I think the way that it's typically described, you have to be careful because different people try to use it to show something different. But the way that I've often heard it used is to show that, look, you can't have a past infinite because you can have this situation where a Grim Reaper appeared who would kill you at 12:30, but then the situation is such that there's always going to be one before him who would appear at 12:15, and then 7:30 or whatever, and then half the distance again and half again, getting closer and closer to 12, but never actually reaching that. And so the question is like, which Grim Reaper kills you? It seems like you have to be dead because there's infinitely many Reapers who are coming to kill you. But if you think about it, no Reaper can actually kill you because there's always a Reaper before him. Now, as far as I can tell, and in discussions with other people, including, I think we talked about this with Malpass as well on one of the streams I did with Nathan from Digital Gnosis. This is just a logical. This situation is logically contradictory. Essentially, it says that you will be killed by someone. You'll be killed by someone that corresponds to the lowest. I'm trying to remember how it goes again. You'll be killed by someone who corresponds to the. Oh yeah, essentially it's like saying the highest natural number would be one way to say it. And there is no
Hmm.
highest natural number because each increment you get closer to 12, you can sort of number that and say that it's a higher number. And there just isn't one. Like there's always a higher one. I describe that better in my book, but the point is I think that it's logically impossible. Now you can phrase the objection in a way where you don't actually assert that it's logically impossible. You just sort of ask the question, and that's asking a question isn't a contradiction, right? But at that case, I would just say, well, the answer is that there is no answer because the situation cannot, like, it's impossible, yes, but it's not impossible because the past can't be infinitely long. It's impossible because you're asking about how could the situation that you've set up involves a contradiction where for the person to die, they would have to be killed by essentially the highest natural number, but there isn't one. So it just doesn't make sense. This is sometimes called the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis, where you've just established two things that individually are possible, but in combination are contradictory. And I think that the problem is that then inferring from that to the impossibility of a past infinite, it just is a non sequitur. Like you don't need to postulate that that's metaphysically impossible to understand why the situation doesn't make sense. All you have to do is show, well, yeah, actually, you can't satisfy both of these at once. Other types of past infinites that don't have grim reapers in them in this way are still quite possible.
That sounds really similar to the 0.99999 repeating, and you say that's equal to 1, but somebody
Yeah, I
says,
hadn't
no,
thought
it's
about
not,
that comparison.
because if you have a 0 point and then put the little line over the 0 and then put a 1 after it, like, no, you can't do that in math. That seems like a logical contradiction to do that. So I think that reminds me of that dichotomy, or the parallel between those two.
Yeah, that's interesting. And in fact, this relates to a point that I critique Craig about, where many of his arguments against the possibility of an actual infinite, such as Hilbert's Hotel, for example, for those who are familiar, just rely on infinities being highly counterintuitive and behaving in ways that are very strange, and which Craig uses the word absurd to describe, although by that he seems to mean metaphysically impossible. And I guess the question would be how you move from strange and weird to metaphysically impossible, which I think is the key issue. But the whole point is that infinities just don't behave like finite numbers. So if you have two infinitely large sets and you ask and you add them together and ask what's the size of the resulting set, like it's the same size. According to the number of even numbers is the same as the number of all of the natural numbers, right? Because you can put them in a one-to-one correspondence. But that seems intuitively silly because we know that half of the numbers are even, right? But that's just the way infinities work. And so a lot of Craig's arguments just rest on these counterintuitive results, which I just find a really weak argument.
Yeah,
But some people find it really intuitive. So I don't know at that point.
yeah, he's
Just,
treating infinites as if they were numbers, and infinites aren't numbers; they're sets, something like that.
well, in one point, I actually discussed that he explicitly does that. He argues that you can't. One of the arguments that he makes is that Hilbert's Hotel shows that a past infinity is impossible because if you had Hilbert's Hotel has an infinite number of guests in it, right? You could remove people out of the hotel, and you could ask how many people were left in the hotel. So, like for example, if you had infinitely many people in the hotel and you removed all of the guests with numbers greater than 500, which would be infinitely many, right? Then you'd have 500 guests left in the hotel. Alternatively, if you removed all the even numbered guests out of the hotel, then you'd have all the odd numbered guests left, but that would still be an infinite number. So the point is, Craig says you could do those things if you had a real hotel, but subtraction is not defined for infinitely large sets. And so there's this incongruity between the idea that you could do it if there was an infinite hotel, but then subtraction just isn't allowed for infinitely large sets. And therefore, he argues that sort of shows that you couldn't really have infinitely many. Now, what I show, and this is actually again, it's in my book. I forget exactly what page. You can look this up if you're interested. Someone else has pointed this out before, so I didn't come up with the idea. But Craig is misunderstanding the notion of subtraction. There's a difference between subtraction and I think the relative complement of sets. And this is exactly what you were saying. Whenever I have a set, whether it's finite or infinitely large, and I take up some elements of the set, I can always tell you the size of the resulting set that's left over, be it infinite or finite. Subtraction is a different operation. Subtraction basically says if I have two, say, sets of a given magnitude and I take one from the other, what is the magnitude of the resulting set? For finite sets, these give you the same results. Like if I have a finite set with 5 elements and take 3 elements out of it, there's going to be 2 left. But infinite sets don't always work like this. Sometimes if you take infinitely many away from infinity, you get 500, like in the case that I just mentioned. If you take away all of the numbers higher than 500, that's infinitely many, but there are 500 left. Whereas if I take away infinitely many odd numbers, and then there's all the even numbers left, but there's infinitely many left. So that's why subtraction is not defined for infinite sets. It's because there's no general answer to if I have this many and I take away this many, how many is left? But there's always a specific answer to any specific set that you actually work with. Again, that sounds bizarre, but that's just how infinities work. So Craig just fundamentally misunderstands this point. So I think you're actually right. He's misunderstanding infinities as the cardinality of the set versus the actual set as its elements. So I think that he repeatedly makes these sort of mistakes where just because things are counterintuitive means that they're impossible.
Yeah, for
I don't
sure.
think it's false at
I
all.
think that's one of the keys to many of apologetics arguments is that they grasp onto people's normal intuitions about how things work, and when it doesn't map onto reality, they let's say, "Oh, must be God," kind of like a God of the gaps, where it says because it doesn't match our intuitions, and our intuitions are they seem to overvalue our intuitions, that therefore this must not be the case.
Yeah, I think that this is definitely the case for a lot of cosmological arguments and a lot of teleological arguments and moral arguments as well. Um, which is interesting because when you move then into theology and start asking questions about the incarnation or the Trinity, or God's divine foreknowledge and the problem of evil and things like this, which are thoroughly counterintuitive, like not just for atheists, but like for a lot of theists as well. Like, hey, these things don't really make sense. Then at that point, they'll say, look, you wouldn't expect our intuitions to apply to God, right? Because God is so far above us, and that's like fair enough, okay. But then why do we rely on our intuitions in this other case? I feel like there's an inconsistency there.
What do you mean? But you brought up the fine tuning argument. How do you think they apply intuitions to the fine tuning argument?
Well, the intuition I think comes there in thinking about, well, there's a number of points. One would be in determining the range of possibilities. Well, that's not a good way to say it. In determining um, how easy or difficult it would be to have life. So, sort of the intuition there. Yeah, maybe it's not quite as directly an appeal to intuition, but I think that it still exists in the form of saying that we've got life the way we know it, right? And then if we change things, so then stars wouldn't be able to form, right? Not like change constants. We wouldn't have stars, or you wouldn't be able to form atoms or whatever. And then the issue is, well, you just wouldn't have anything, or you'd have a universe of dust or whatever. I mean, and I know that even not all atheists agree with me on this point, but I'm not convinced that we really know what alternative forms of life would even be possible. In radically different universes with different constants. Um, and I think that there's too much reliance on essentially the idea that essentially it's an appeal to incredulity that or lack of imagination. We can't imagine any forms of life that would exist in these radically alien universes. Therefore, there can't be any. Whereas I would say that we're fundamentally ignorant about what these alternatives look like. But that's only one side of it. I think the other side of it, which is maybe even more relevant to this point, is anthropomorphizing God. So basically, the idea is okay, suppose the universe is fine tuned. That is, that if you tweak the constants, no life would be possible, even alien forms of life. So the question is, does God provide an explanation for that? Which he's supposed to, right? Because that's the whole point of the argument. And I contend that he doesn't, or at least he doesn't, unless you presuppose that God has a reason to create physically embodied life that is fine tuned based on the physical constants. Now, I think anthropomorphizing God as some sort of like the kind of big sky daddy who has to sort of create a universe and wants humans to do his stuff in a physical world for like whatever reason. If you think that God is kind of like that, then maybe it makes sense that he would do this. But like that's God isn't like that. Like God isn't immaterial. If God exists, he's immaterial and he's all powerful and all knowing and perfectly self-sufficient. So why does he need to create anything? Why does he need to create life? Why does he need a physical universe? Even if he has a physical universe, why would he need it to be fine-tuned? Because he can do miracles, right? So he could have life even though it wasn't fine-tuned for life. So the point is, I think thinking about God as if he's just a big, powerful person, even implicitly, like I'm not saying explicitly that's what people have in their mind, but just not sort of thinking through the idea that God, God is not like a mechanic who is constrained by the laws of the car that he's working with. God is the ultimate designer of everything, and indeed, he's self-sufficient, so he doesn't even need a car. Like, so why is he tinkering with the car? Like, that's what I mean. I think it's appealing to our intuitions about what a designer would be without thinking through that. It's completely unclear why any of these would apply to God if God did exist.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I think it just kicks the can back down the road because even if you grant that God does have this nature, this moral nature, that he has a reason to set all these constants to make exactly life the way it is in science and whatever else you want, it seems like that his nature must be equally as fine-tuned as the universe, because you could just tweak his moral nature a little bit and say, this is a god that only wants to make black holes, or this is a god that only wants
Yeah.
unicorns. And so even if the universe was fine-tuned, to say that there is a god who made it would only not answer the question, because there's equally as many variations of gods as possible kinds of a universe, because there could be one kind of god for each potential kind of universe.
Yeah, well, so what they'll typically say to that is that, well, God's nature is necessary, um, and therefore there aren't other possibilities. There's just one. Now, I think that there are there are two problems with that. One is that we could just say, well, the universe is necessary, and this is what Oppie does, right? So we're even, except we've got less things in our ontology, so it seems that that's superior. But the other possibility, which I think is more interesting, is that at least traditionally, as I understand it, although God's nature in some sense is necessary, there are many things that God freely chooses to do, and creation is supposed to be one of those. And depending on how much of a theological voluntarist you are, God's commandments are also maybe freely chosen. That is, he could have commanded different things. So different people will say different things about how true that is. But the point is, the more voluntarist you are about God, not just in terms of morality, but in terms of how much freedom he had in terms of creating or whether he created and so forth, then the more this fine tuning question creeps back, essentially, because you can say, well, why did God create it this way instead of this other way? And this comes back to the libertarian agent point we were talking about before, right? Because I think that, and this is what Craig says, as far as I can tell, it's just that, well, he just did. And there's no further explanation, and no further explanation is needed. That's just all there is to it, right? He just did make this specific choice, and it sort of doesn't matter. A little bit of this came up in the conversation I had with Luke Barnes as well, who's an astrophysicist I debated the fine tuning argument with. He sort of saw what I was coming at when I was raising these objections, but he just didn't seem to be too bothered by the fact that, well, God just did it this way. I mean, that's just what he chose to do. And I think that's an inconsistency. If it is possible for God to have chosen different possibilities, then why not? Why should we not require an explanation for that? If we're going to say that doesn't need an explanation, then why can't the naturalists just say, yeah, the universe could have had different constants, but it just didn't? Essentially, that's just saying it's a brute fact. So I think that there's inconsistent standards here about what's allowed to be either a brute fact or a necessity. Brute fact, as Oppie says, it is something that could have been different but just wasn't, and there's no explanation for it. Whereas a necessity couldn't have been different, so there's nothing to explain. Theists often appeal to these, especially when you're talking about God's choices. God's free choices are basically just brute facts, or they're determined by his nature, which is necessary. So either it's a brute fact or it's necessary. But in every single case, be it fine tuning of the universe, moral values, resurrecting Jesus, I can just appeal to either necessity or brute fact to explain that without appealing to God. So this is why I think that theistic explanations, as you're sort of pointing out, are almost always flawed, because they don't explain anything. They just appeal to either necessity or brute fact. In my view, the only way to get around this is to postulate basically a very particular theology, which says, look, God has this nature which leads to this, and then all this stuff that fits together. And then things can make sense. But the problem is then you have to establish those theologies, like independently of the things they're supposed to explain. And I think that just doesn't really work. So at the end of the day, I think that most theistic explanations are just non-explanatory.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's why I go with naturalistic pantheism. Just say, oh yeah, we have a natural world that can do all of this stuff on its own. It's magically divine. Let's go into the moral argument a bit. So, what is your view
Sure.
on the moral argument?
Well, again, one has to be cautious here. There are different forms of the moral argument. The one that I most frequently encounter is, I'd say broadly, uh, influenced by William Lane Craig's version of the argument, which I think is extremely crude and basically worthless, which essentially just says that you can't have objective moral values if God doesn't exist, and doesn't really have a reason as to why. Uh, that might sound like I'm strawmanning. I don't think it is. So look at my book and the videos I've done on this. It's really unclear what Craig's argument is supposed to be as to why you can't have objective moral values without God. It's clear that that's what he thinks, but I don't think he has a clear reason. Um, so I don't even really think that's an argument. It's just an assertion. I think it's just an appeal to the incredulity of Christians or theistically minded persons who think of morality in theistic terms, who think of it as a series of divine edicts. And if that's what morality is, well, of course you can't have that without God, right? But the question is that the best way to think about morality? And I don't think it is. I'm a moral realist, so I think that there are objective moral facts. I don't think that obviously morality consists of divine edicts. To put it simply, I'm an ethical naturalist, so I think that ethical facts relate to facts about human well-being and flourishing. I don't want to restrict it to humans, but it's just often easier to talk about humans. But it would apply to other animals as well. And so there are going to be cases that are borderline, and we could debate about, how to determine well-being and things like that. But I mean, I just think that this is a more parsimonious and more relevant grounding of morality. Like the example I think of is if you see someone being tortured in front of you, you'd sort of think, well, this is horrible because it's hurting the person, right? Whereas the theist, it seems, would have to say this is horrible because God said not to torture, and the reason He said not to torture is because that hurts people. It just seems to be, well, it isn't a proof, right? But it's sort of a way to think about why do we need this extra step? It seems just a better grounding to me just to say that it's just about what helps and harms people. So I'm just not persuaded that theistic metaethics adds much.
Yeah, from my understanding, the argument I normally get is that in order to have any kind of oughts or moral obligation, you need some kind of edict from a mind. And if it doesn't come from an
Yeah.
edict from mind, what could possibly account for those kinds of ought statements or any kind of morality? That seems to be the sticking point. And I think I've heard Craig say that on a few occasions where he gives the same
Yeah,
argument.
that's right. So he does. Craig has a few forms or things to focus on, and that's one of the things he says. So he talks about moral values and moral obligations or duties, and so this, what you've said, relates more to the duties part of it. So this notion of what's sometimes called normativity, sort of oughtness or what you ought to do. This is something I've been thinking more about recently, and it is a tricky issue. Now, I don't think that I don't think that. Okay, let me take a step back. So, if we're going to talk about normativity or oughts, we I think should think about um, we should think about how we use oughts across the board. And it seems to me that there aren't just moral oughts, or at least plausibly. There are many candidate oughts. Like um, there are epistemic oughts as well. So you say like you ought to believe this on the basis of this evidence. And I don't think that's exactly a moral claim. That's a claim about like, what's sort of rational or what the evidence in front of you entails that you should think. Um, I mean, there are legal oughts. Some people think that there are like special parental obligations that you have in virtue of being a parent. So there are many forms of oughts, at least plausibly, that we have. And so the question would be, well, what sort of things do I think these are? Do I think they exist at all? Or if so, how do they work? Um, and obviously, different people have different views on this. The question would be, do I think we need God to explain oughts or normativity? And I guess the only way that would be the case is if your theory of oughts, as you were just saying, is if, look, to have a ought, an ought comes from a legitimate authority. This is the strongest form of the argument that I've heard. Um, and in the case of the legal system, the legitimate authority might be the government, right? So that's how you get legal oughts. Um, but in the case of morality, the legitimate authority is God, right? And so without God, you don't have a legitimate authority to give the obligations. Now, I don't think that's a very good theory of normativity. For one thing, I would say it doesn't seem to account for epistemic normativity very well. I guess you could say that God serves that as well, but I'm just not quite sure that that works in the same way. Like God's supposed to give us commandments, but I don't know that God gives us. Does He give us epistemic commandments? Like, I don't know. Maybe the theist would want to say that, but I've sort of not really heard that fleshed out so much. Um, and indeed, it often seems like that there's a strand of theistic belief or Christian belief, which seems to say the opposite, that God wants us to believe in spite of the evidence or something. And in which case, it seems that it's sort of hard to understand what God thinks about the status of evidence. And so I think that this sort of argument is underdetermines the sort of oughts that we have. But another objection would just be to say that it's not clear to me that you need to have an authority to establish normativity. So language, I think, would be a good example of this. So there are linguistic oughts, right? There are things that you can say which are just not grammatical or don't make sense. They're not good English, and there isn't an authority that establishes that. That's established by um, the
Society.
practice of the linguistic community. Yeah, society would be a crude way to put it. And it's more to it that it doesn't mean everyone gets an equal vote. Some people are more linguistically competent than others, but there's no central authority is the point that establishes those. The rules of etiquette could be another example of this, which are not, I mean, there are guides you can consult, but they're not the authorities on that. These things are determined in a sort of a bottom-up way. Prices would be another example, right? So this is not maybe exactly a normativity, but I think it illustrates a similar point. I can be wrong about the economic value of an item. Like there's an objective fact of that's determined by the price you can sell it at, but there's no authority that sets those for a lot of things. Like it's just set by supply and demand. So the point is there are lots of sort of decentralized processes that can give rise to objective things, including in some cases plausibly oughts of a sort. And I think moral oughts are more like that. There's more to say than that. Obviously, I don't want to. Well, maybe we'll get into more details. But the point is, I don't think that you need a central authority to be the basis of oughts, and I don't think that is the best theory of oughts because As I said, I think it underdetermines these other sorts of normative notions that we have. And so I don't think it's the best source in the case of God either.
Yeah, so to answer your question, I do think that God does give epistemic edicts as well. I think that logic corresponds to God's natures or thinking God's thoughts after him or that kind of argument. So I do think in the theistic worldview, they do have an answer that says that, yes, he also gives epistemic oughts. But I would ask that I think they would make the distinction between oughts as a product of society as being purely subjective. So those, even though they objectively exist, like my thoughts of an elephant objectively exist, they're purely subjectively
Yeah.
contingent on my mind. So they're not objective in the sense that they mean by objective morality, and that it's some kind of
Yeah.
thing that applies to all people outside of not contingently on space and time or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. So I don't think that that's a standard. I mean, at this point, you can argue about the proper use of the word subjective. I would say that's a non-standard use of the word subjective in this context, right? In terms of, say, morality and other things, subjective usually means it's dependent on the subject forming the belief. So a belief is subjective if its truth value is dependent on the subject who forms it. Um, so in that sense, let's take the rules of English, for example. The rules of English are not subjective in that sense. They don't depend on a single person's judgment about them. They are intersubjective in the sense that they depend on humans existing. So if all humans disappear, then there wouldn't be any usage facts about English. Sure, and I'm quite happy to say that morality is intersubjective in that sense, that if all humans, let's say conscious sentient beings elsewhere as well, just disappeared, then there wouldn't be any moral facts. But I don't see that as a problem. Indeed, it seems a bit meaningless to say that if all that existed was God, I mean, would there be morality? Like it seems that the theists, if they're a theological voluntarist, then they're committed to saying that morality is actually grounded in on God's commandments. So if God didn't command anything, which presumably he wouldn't if he was the only being that existed, then there wouldn't be any morality. So that's actually why, classically at least, theological voluntarism has been classified as a subjectivist theory of ethics because it is dependent on a subject that is God's opinion of things. It's just that that subject is thought to hold sort of a I don't know, normative force or an objective standing with respect to humanity. But I don't actually think it removes you from mind dependence because it is dependent on God's mind. I think theists are just generally comfortable with that. And I would just say, well, look, I'm just comfortable with the idea that if all sentient beings didn't exist, then there wouldn't be moral facts. That doesn't seem like an issue to me. Moral facts seem to be just precisely about the well-being of those beings. So if all that existed were rocks, then I just don't see the problem with there being no morality.
Well, would you say that there's like, I would say that morality could exist as a potential, like if potentially
Yeah, yeah,
beings
yeah.
existed in this world, then you could assess its morality of how much it's going to
Yeah,
hurt
that's
or.
right. Yeah, that's fine. But you could say that about effectively anything that doesn't exist but could potentially exist. There's a potential fact of the matter about it, but it wouldn't actually exist. Yeah, I'm fine with that.
And what about the Euthyphro dilemma? Do you think Craig's response to the Euthyphro dilemma is a valid critique?
Yeah, so he uses what's his name? I think Robert Adams, who has advocated a modified divine command theory, which says that God's I need to reread the paper actually, but the idea is that God's
Nature?
commandments are not arbitrary, but are grounded in His nature, which is all good. And so this allegedly avoids the dilemma. And this is the main response that I've heard from apologists recently. Now, I think that this is a really bad response. I actually don't think it makes a lot of sense. So, um, first of all, traditional theological voluntarism says that God has complete freedom about what he commands. He can command whatever he wants. That's the, like voluntarist in the name. So if you're going to say that God is constrained by his nature, then it's sounding a lot, it starts to sound a lot like God actually is constrained by something. And they'll say, yeah, he is constrained, but it's part of him. So it's not external. But sort of, to me, that's still a problem because God's nature is supposed to be necessary. So it seems that there are necessary truths. If this modified command theory is correct, there are necessary truths about morality. If there are necessary truths about morality, then I'm not actually sure that it even matters whether God exists or not. I mean, God's existence is necessary, so at that point, everything that follows is necessary. But the point is, as I've argued, that you can then just make an ideal observer argument to say that look, in that case, there are necessary truths about morality, so therefore, you could, as a non-theist, you could say, look, morality is grounded in what a omnipotent and omniscient ideal observer would command if they existed, essentially making it a counterfactual. But I don't see that as a problem. Now, the reason the reason why this isn't an objection to traditional theological voluntarism is that there aren't any facts about morality separately from God making the commandments, right? So you can't say that there's a divine what a what a being would command, or would suggest if they existed, because there aren't any facts about the matter. They could do whatever, like they're purely free and it's voluntary. So that objection doesn't work to classical divine command theory, but it works to the modified version, as far as I can see, because now there are supposed to be um, necessary truths about what a being like God would command. So you can just ground morality in those. And
Oh
so I
yeah,
think it undercuts the whole motivation for having to have God exist, because you can just ground it in these counterfactuals.
yeah, exactly. That's why the modified version I use, the version of the Euthyphro I made up, is something good because God consciously deems it so, or did he consciously deem it so for some other reason, non-conscious reason? And if you bite the bullet and say, oh no, it's because of a non-conscious reason, well then apparently you don't need consciousness for morality, because his consciousness isn't generating the morality, it's just
Mm.
assessing it or locating it in something
Yeah.
non-conscious.
Yeah, I think that that's a good way to articulate it. I think that some theists may object to distinguishing God, because there are some people who hold to a theory called divine simplicity, which says that God is identical to all of his properties or attributes. Now, if they believe it, Craig doesn't adhere to that, by the way. But if you do adhere to that, then they're probably not going to agree with the distinction that you just made. But I think that this doctrine is extremely hard to understand. It means that um, God's. I mean, this is a criticism I make, right? So God supposedly has lots of properties. Like one is that he's not physical. Another one is he's omnipotent. Another one is that he's triune, right? So he has a lot of different properties. So according to divine simplicity, these are all the same, right? Because if each of these properties is the same as God, then they must be the same as each other. So I can't make any sense of that. Some people claim to. Okay, good on them. But the point here is that if God is if God is the same as all of his attributes, then all of his moral attributes must be the same as non-moral attributes. And so I'm just confused at that point. But suppose divine simplicity is false, right? And you can make these distinctions, like you just made, between like God's conscious and non-conscious attributes, or components, right? Now I think you run into a new problem. If you say that morality, I argue this in my book as well. If you say that morality is grounded in God's nature, then it seems that you need more of an account, right? You need to say, well, what aspects of God's nature, or what parts of God's nature? This is effectively what what you were saying gets at, but I'm just articulating a slightly different way. Because you don't want to say that it's all aspects of God's nature, because like the fact that God is triune, for example, or non-physical, presumably is not morally relevant. Like it doesn't have any bearing on his moral commandments that he would make. At least it's not obvious to me how it would. So what you want to say, of course, well, no, it's his moral attributes that give rise to the commandments that he makes, like the fact that he's good and patient and loving and whatever else. But here's the problem. There is no ability to define what is good or moral apart from God's attributes. So you can't say that it's God's moral attributes, because morality is defined purely in terms of God's nature. So either you sort of take all of God's nature, or you have something external to God that specifies which parts of God's nature are the moral making parts of it. But there can't be any such thing under modified divine command theory, because morality is just grounded in God's nature. So it seems to me that you get this implication that all of God's attributes, including the ones that seem to have no bearing on morality, like the fact that he's non-spatial or triune or whatever, are somehow determine moral facts. But that just seems clearly wrong. Like that, what does that have to do with? Whereas I think that the naturalist says, look, it's about human well-being. Like this seems a far better answer than trying to have this convoluted connection to all of these non-moral attributes.
Do you think there could be a naturalistic kind of objective morality, like an undiscovered law of nature, or something we just don't know about yet or don't understand, like the Platonic object model of morality?
Oh, yeah. So I would put that in a class of non-naturalism, although the way people use naturalism is highly inconsistent. So, but traditionally those would be called ethical non-naturalist forms. I think that those are plausible. I don't think they're as plausible as naturalism, basically because I'm not a fan of Platonic objects or abstract objects. I think that my big problem is explaining how we can have knowledge of them and how they can sort of interact with the physical world, as it seems that they would need to in order for us to know. I know that there are some attempts that have been made to explain that, and I want to read more about this. But I'm so far not convinced. But I don't think these are necessarily insurmountable. So yeah, I think that's quite possible. And basically, under that model, morality would be essentially moral truths would be very abstract truths, um, analogous to mathematics, except well, not exactly the same as mathematics, right? But perhaps there'd be very abstract truths about what everyone would agree to behind a veil of ignorance. So that would be more like a contractarian model, or perhaps there'd be abstract truths about what is in an agent's best interest from agent independent point of view. So this is an argument that Singer makes, like point of view invariance. You sort of abstract yourself from a particular point of view, and uh, those are different models that I've heard about it. But I think that I think that the issue there is if you're going to say that they're not um, facts about the physical world, then how do we come to know them? But it's a possibility. I think that it's more plausible than grounding it in God's nature,
What would you think about
which
like? Because my view is I take it full naturally and just say morality is an undiscovered law of physics, like just gravity, just something we just haven't discovered yet. Would that seem to be an implausible explanation to you?
yeah. Well, I mean, so I, I don't reify laws of nature in the sense that I don't think like the law of gravity or quantum mechanics are like laws that have their own existence. I think that they're just descriptions of how certain things behave. Um, so if you were to say that morality is a law of nature, to me, the way I would interpret that is to say that morality is a description of how certain things behave. But then the question would be, well, what is the content of that description and what are the things that you're describing? Now, in a sense, I'd be all right with that because to me, the answer to that would be, well, it relates to how humans or like sentient beings, but let's just say humans behave and how they interact with each other and how they feel and things. I wouldn't use the phrase law of nature to describe that because it sounds like something a bit different to that. But I don't know that that's what you're thinking of, though.
Yeah, I'm going more specifically, saying there's actually a field exactly like gravity, a field of some kind of interactions between particles or whatever, and it affects conscious agents' brain in such a way to produce morality or moral feelings, moral intuitions. So I'd say there's like actually some kind of physical field out there, the moral field that causes these things.
Hmm. That sounds almost a bit like panpsychism. So, yeah, at that point, I would say I feel like that's an unnecessary addition to our ontology that is not needed to give an account of morality.
Oh, sure, I did grant that. I don't. If I had empirical proof that was required, then I'd have a Nobel Prize. But I think
Right.
it's a more
Well, sure,
plausible
yeah.
explanation than like God or something. I think that,
Right, yeah, yeah, I see what you're saying.
and the
Yeah,
question
well,
here is like the hard thing is like, as you mentioned before, theists usually intuitively have this feeling that you need this big sky daddy mind thing to ground morality, and the trick is how do you explain to people that you don't need that for morality since it's been ingrained in society for so long. It's very hard to get past people's intuition that you need that kind of a authority to ground morality.
yeah, I that's a really good point or slash question. I've had a few dialogues recently with uh, Bread of Life or Rebecca, who has a Bread of Life channel, and she as she says, she's not really an apologist, but she is interested in talking about this. She's a really nice person, but she has a very strong view, which I think is fair to say is mostly an intuitive view that you just can't have objective morality without God. And we've talked about this for some amount of time, and I feel that as well. That there's just that there's a resistance to really even being able to conceptualize the idea. And I don't really know how to break through that. There's various ways that I've tried to appeal to, because even some atheists have this idea as well. It's not just theists. I think that part of it is strongly cultural. In that there's such an association between, like, the Ten Commandments being a classical example and morality, that it just shapes the way people think about it. And at some point, like, if in their minds morality just is what God says, well then that conception of morality is impossible if God doesn't exist, right? The question would be, how much does that conception of morality actually map to the morality that we do and like talk with when we're not thinking in those terms? Because I don't think it maps very well to it at all. The Ten Commandments are actually a good example of this. You look at the Ten Commandments, four of them relate to how we relate to God and have no bearing on how we treat other people. And most of the others, do not steal, do not commit adultery. Those are good things, right? But there's so much more to morality that doesn't fit into that. Gossiping and I don't know, backbiting and defrauding people. I mean, you could fit it into those, but the point is, it doesn't. There's so much morality that's not obviously contained in things like that we have built on. A good example I like to give is slavery, which, although Christians like to claim that the anti-slavery movement was grounded in Christian doctrines, it's true that many of the early abolitionists were Christians, but of course, so were all of the people who opposed them as well. Like, almost everyone was a Christian then. So my question is, if Christianity is fundamentally and intrinsically anti-slavery, why did it take 1800 years for people to figure it out? Um, the point there is, I think that there's a lot that goes on to moral progress and understanding these things over time that you just don't straightforwardly get out of the Ten Commandments or even like the New Testament. There is some good stuff in there, don't get me wrong. I think that the Beatitudes and things, that there's some important moral truths there, but that could be said about many world traditions. And I think that getting people to see this is it's just really hard, because I think that there's almost two hats that people. There's the everyday morality hat, which often has little connection to this sort of biblical stuff, other than in very vague terms. And then there's the where does morality come from hat, and then people just think about God. So I don't really know how to get around that.
Yeah, for sure. What, as a moral realist, what do you think is the best way to assess different models of morality to try to determine which one do you think is the best?
So do you mean meta-ethics or do you mean ethical theories?
Metaethics, probably.
Yeah, yeah. Like what morality is. What's the best way? Yeah, okay. So that's a good question. The approach that I take is, or try to take, is pretty well. I don't think ethics is special in this sense. I think that this is an approach that should be applied broadly to pretty much all questions in philosophy, and that is sort of it's sort of a two-stage approach. This is influenced for people who might be interested. It's related to something called a Canberra program, or I think program is the word that they used.
How do you spell
There are
that?
people who criticize. Oh, Canberra, Canberra. It's named after the capital city of Australia, where a number of these philosophers worked back in the day. But the basic idea is that it's sort of a two-stage process. The first stage is conceptual, and the second stage is empirical. Um, so, I mean, there's more to. I just want to be clear here. There's more to what they said than that, and I'm not tying myself to everything that they said. I just think that this is useful, and it's interesting to note that you can look this up if you want to talk about it. But basically, the first thing when we're thinking about a philosophical question is we have to get our terms straight. So suppose I want to ask a question like, "What is morality?" or "Do we have free will?" or "What is causation?" or "Does God exist?" But like whatever the question is, we're using words there, right? And typically these words are words that we're sort of familiar with. We use a lot, or synonyms, like causing, for example, or good and bad, and free, and so forth. But they're kind of tricky. Often we use them in different ways, and people disagree about exactly how to apply them, and we're not quite sure what they refer to. So they're tricky terms, these contested terms. So what we should do is try to get clear about what we're even talking about, because, I mean, the example I like to give is, if you ask me, do unicorns exist? There's no possible way I can answer that until I know what a unicorn is supposed to be, right? How else could I possibly answer that question until you tell me what you mean by unicorn? At least roughly. Like, I'm not saying we have to get absolutely precise, but we need a rough idea of what we're talking about. And so the first stage is then some sort of conceptual analysis phase where we just try to work out what the term refers to. And that's going to be determined, I think, by usage. So how do people use the term? I think language is determined by usage. And so this comes back to the meaning of words we were talking about before. So philosophers typically use introspection and thought experiments to think about this. I think those are helpful, but I don't think that they can do everything for us. In particular, the more thought experiments remove themselves from typical usages of the term, the less useful I think they are, because I think basically the, the reference of these terms like free or good and bad and things like that is determined by their usage in typical contexts. And the more you move away from those contexts, they probably just don't have a well-specified meaning. And so I think that thought experiments can be used, but you have to be careful. The more basically elaborate and contrived and distant they become, then the more suspicious I get. But we can use them to try to work out how would we use this concept, right? So we do some of this, and ideally we talk to different people and we try to read literature and we get an idea of how a term is used, like freedom. When would we say a person is free? When would we say they're not free, for example? So once we've done that, then we turn to the question of, okay, so this is roughly what we think the term refers to. So then what would need to exist in reality in order for this to make sense? Because the first stage is just working out what we're talking about. It doesn't say whether it exists or not. So this would be like, what does a unicorn have to be? Well, it has to be like basically a horse, but it has to have a horn of some sort. But the horn can't be just like something you stuck on or a decoration. It has to be like biologically part of it, like a naturally as part of the creature. And then you could ask, does it have to have magical powers? Maybe you say yes, no. That would be, we could debate about that. The point is, once we've worked out kind of what we think a unicorn is, then we go and see, okay, do such things exist? Is there evidence of them, right? And that might be difficult to do. We may not be able to test it immediately. A lot of philosophical questions, it is hard to test whether they exist. But this is the sort of two-stage process that I think about it. And basically the second stage is effectively a scientific endeavor. I think of philosophy as contiguous with the sciences, but that's sort of another question. Now, I say this is a two-stage process, but of course, there's going to be a back and forth here. And this relates to an idea called reflective equilibrium, where you sort of go back and forth between specific cases and general theories. So you think about an idea, you think, this is kind of what I think about it. Can such a thing exist? Or like, does it exist? What's the evidence? And then you might have to go back and tinker with your own idea about it to fit better. And this is not something that's unique to philosophy. This happens, this happens in science all the time. And the best example that I'm aware of is the idea of an atom. The word atom literally meant indivisible. And the idea was they're basically billiard balls that made up all of matter. Now, our current model of an atom is so different to that as to raise the question to why we even use the same name for it. but we use the same name for it because there's a historical continuity and a shared reference that there is something out there that we had some understanding of in the past when we thought it was a billiard ball, but it was an imperfect understanding. We've improved our understanding of it. And as our understanding improved, our model of it changed. So I think that's how we should approach philosophical disputes as well, including morality. I realize this is a long answer, but I feel like it's sort of necessary. So the way we should approach morality is to think carefully about how we use moral terms, what we think is good or bad, like when we deploy these, and then go and think about what kind of theory would we construct to make sense of that, and then go and see whether that theory fits with a world that we think exists. So do we think that the way we use moral terms is best explained by a divine command theory? And if so, what sort of commands would those have to be? Like, is there such a God? Plausibly, I think that the Christians believe in a God that they don't even think exists on the basis of their Old Testament. Because I think that plausibly the God that they think exists isn't the same God as is manifested in the Old Testament because he seems to be horrible. But anyway, that's another argument there. But the point is then if we don't find that, then we maybe have to go back to the drawing board and think, okay, maybe we need to revise our concepts a little bit. So this is how I think that we should pursue. And basically, I think that we are going to need to revise some of our concepts about morality. Certainly, a lot of people seem to think that there is a need for some sort of supernatural, transcendent lawgiver. And in so much as that may be part of the Western notion of morality, I think it's got to go. But I think that there's plenty left when you remove that. We don't have to throw away everything. And so there's a scholar whom I'm influenced by called Peter Railton, and he's an ethical naturalist as well. And he calls this a reforming or reformist notion of morality. And I think that that is a good way to think about it as well. What we shouldn't be trying to do is think about all the things we find intuitive about morality and then just try to find a theory that maximizes the number of things that are sort of pre-theoretically intuitive. I don't think that's the right approach. There needs to be a sort of a fit between usage of the term and theories and consistency with other things that we think exist and how well the theory can account for that. And so some intuitions that we may have may not be relevant to either of those, and that we should just discard those intuitions. And that can be a difficult process. Obviously, I don't have an algorithm for working out exactly how to do all those steps, but that's why philosophy and science generally is difficult.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's exactly the same process I'm using, and that's why in my morality, I think that oughtness and normativity, I think, are the things that are probably going to need to go. Like, I tend to agree with most of the theists that I don't think there is this oughtness or normativity anywhere in the natural world. I think it's just more of like a hypothetical, imperative, hypothetical imperative, where it's like, I ought to do this if I want to do what want to achieve this or whatever. And I think that as our understanding of morality will evolve and our definitions change, as you mentioned, I think that it's going to change to be more of a description of this is what the best way the world could be for conscious agents. So I think that my grounding for objective morality is the idea of the best of all possible worlds, to steal Leibniz's term, which is one where essentially it's impossible to force any conscious agent to do anything they don't consent to doing. And I think that that will essentially be the foundation of our morality in the future. So like even rocks falling on people, I think we will see as immoral in the future. That's a prediction I hope to verify in the future. And that I think this pattern is going to be consistent across conscious agents anywhere in the universe. Even AIs, non-evolutionary creatures will probably adopt this same kind of morality with given enough resources and intellectual processing power. What do you think about
that? So I agree with some of that. So, I mean, I think, well, I don't know if you know, Nathan and I did a review of one of your videos where you talk about this. And one thing that I disagree with, I guess, is the usage of immoral to describe rocks falling on a person. See, it seems to me, and of course this is where intuitions can differ, it seems to me that ascriptions of right and wrong or moral and immoral are only appropriate to moral agents. I mean, to take that example, I think it would be odd to say that rocks falling on people was wrong. I think it would make perfect sense to say that it was bad. But that's where I would distinguish terms about value from terms about rightness or wrongness. And so you may well want to abolish that distinction. And it sort of seems like perhaps that is actually where you want to go. In which case, then you would just sort of say, well, maybe that's how we use it now, but we should sort of get rid of that. Now, the way I think about freedom and rationality and various other things means that I'm going to get off the boat there. I don't think we want to remove that distinction. I think it's a relevant and important distinction, but that's a further discussion to have. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the more basic idea of morality is about shaping the universe so that it is in accordance with what people want it to be. That is effectively how I think about morality as well. Some of the details may well differ, but yeah, that's going to be a question of what This is a question of whether you want to preserve and reform terms that we use, or you want to abolish them, and that's actually that's really tricky. I think that that's one of the ongoing issues in the literature about this as well. Some people are happy with, some naturalists are happy with normative terms. Some think that they do need to be either significantly reformed or just abolished.
Yeah, but my intuition is that normative language like moral and immoral, they seem to have a significantly greater weight than terms like good or bad. Like it seems like if something is moral, that matters more than something being good. And so when we think of like a rock falling on someone and killing someone, we label that as bad. Versus a person killing someone, which we label as immoral. It seems
Yeah.
like the moral significance of those two is about the same. Like I don't see that the words map onto the reality of the consequences there. So to me, it seems like in the future, when we do have a greater understanding of morality, since I think we are perfectly determined, I don't think there's any free choices. I don't think there's a fundamental difference between a person killing another person and a rock killing a person. I think it's more just
Yeah.
determined facts about the universe. And I think that the language of morality, because it does have this greater weight to it, would be more accurately applied to both cases than this word of good or bad, which doesn't seem to have the same weight to it.
Yeah, that all makes sense coming from the point of view of rejecting the notion of agency or free will. Now, I'm a compatibilist about free will, and I think that the uh, distinction between agents and non-agents is important. When I say agent, I'm not talking about like a libertarian agent there. I'm just talking about some sort of physical system that can incorporate information, make decisions. And so computers could, I don't think currently they're agents, but they could be described as those in the future. I think that distinction is important, and I think it's fundamental to our notion of morality, which is why we don't ascribe moral blame or praise to inanimate objects, and we ascribe a smaller component of that to, say, children or mentally impaired persons, and a greater to adult, ordinary, properly thinking persons. Now, we could just say that all of that discourse is confused. I'm inclined to say that it isn't, and I think that there is a very important social function to ascriptions of blame and praise, which relates to basically setting up incentives that shape people's behavior. And I think that that is actually a large part of what moral discourse is about. It's about trying to shape people's behavior through this use of language. And so again, all of it's going to set up to what do we mean by these terms, and then what has to be true. I think that this can all be understood in naturalist terms. But if you come to it with a different starting point, where you think that in order to, say, hold someone blameworthy for something, that they need to have like libertarian agent caused that thing, then the discourse is not going to make sense, right? If you don't believe in that sort of agency. My response to that would be to say, well, yeah, so we shouldn't think of it in that way. And it's not even clear that it makes a lot of sense to think of it that way in the first place. But certainly what we know about science is that it's hard to fit libertarian agency in there. So let's not think of it that way. And let's give a compatibilist reading of what this discourse means. I think we'd be giving up a lot if we gave up the distinctions between agents and non-agents and the effects they have on people. Because I think that does form an important social function. You might argue that in some sort of utopian future, that distinction wouldn't be relevant and we wouldn't need to use moral discourse in this way. At that point, I would say, I'm just not sure what that would look like.
Well,
So
I would go
maybe,
almost. So I'd do that pretty much exactly the same
yeah,
thing and say, imagine in the future when there's very little crime, there's very few people killing other people, and most deaths happen naturally. Like I forget what it's called, Nick Bostrom's Black Dragon of Death or whatever. When we get to the point where most crime is gone and people don't kill other people and most deaths are by nature, at that point, do you think we're just going to stop using the words moral or immoral? Or do you think we're going to start to transition from using those to a more broad sense? Because it seems like the pattern of moral progress is that as we gain more resources and availability to offer people freedoms, then the scope of morality tends to increase from the leader to the tribe to the men and the women to the slaves to the animals to the plants, because there are many people who think it's immoral to kill plants. That's a thing. And so it seems like the scope of morality is increasing and due to our availability of resources. And so I think once we get to the point where we have enough resources that people essentially just don't commit crimes anymore, no more murder, I think that the scope of morality is going to continue to increase to go towards that inanimate object rock falls on you. So even though today I totally agree with you, I think there's the usage of that language is predetermined by its utility and effect on changing people's actions in society. Once we get to that point, societally and technologically, I think morality, the term morality, will naturally progress to include rocks falling on people. I think that's just seems to follow the same pattern as it has for the past thousands of years. Would you disagree with that?
Well, it's well, a couple of points here. So I think morality is definitely about more than just extreme actions like killing people. So even if there was no crime, I think there's still going to be moral and immoral acts that we can take. Like even say teasing and gossiping about someone can be harmful in ways that's certainly not criminal. But I mean, we can include that as well if you like to, just to make the point. So I'm not really sure what a society like that would look like. Plausibly, we would have a very different usage of moral terms, or maybe not even used at all. So I guess I'm not really too concerned about speculating about that. One point, though, I'd make about the expanding moral circle that you've mentioned. I think there is a distinction between the expanding circle of moral agents and moral patients. I mean, I guess you're wanting to abolish the distinction effectively, or at least abolish the notion of moral agency.
Right.
I think we have been expanding the moral patients. So back back into the Neolithic past, it was basically just your tribe, and then we sort of extended that to city states and nation states, and then maybe your race, and then ultimately all of humanity. And now we're, I think, hopefully extending this to animals, and there are people who want to include plants and other parts of the natural environment there, maybe AIs at some point in the future. But not all of these are moral agents. Certainly, many animals aren't, or only maybe chimpanzees in a very limited sense. Now, I suppose you could argue by analogy, well, we expanded moral patience, and so we can expand the realm of moral agents
Oh,
to
I'd go
include
the other
rocks,
way.
or just eliminate. Yeah.
So,
Well,
because it seems like moral agents
sorry,
have
go
been
ahead.
decreasing. Like we see, like the guy the Texas sharpshooter who went around and shot a bunch of people from the tower. Like, well, he wasn't a moral agent because he had a tumor in his brain. Or the Sam Harris argument
Yeah,
that
right.
psychopaths aren't really criminals; they're not moral agents; they're just determined by their brain structure. So it seems like just as the moral what for what the term you call it, the people who are the victims,
Patience.
patients.
Yeah.
While that one
People
is
who have moral weight, or
yeah,
animals. Yeah.
the people who can be hurt immorally.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
That bubble is increasing while the moral agent bubble is
Right.
decreasing. That's what I see.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so in terms of the moral agent bubble, that's I think it is right that we have more of an awareness now about the way in which people's agency can be diminished by certain neurological effects, or substance abuse and other things. But I think, I suppose it's very hard to then extrapolate that into, well, what would it look like in the indefinite future? I would say that I would not like to see that distinction be diminished. While it is important to have an appreciation of the way that people's agency can legitimately be diminished by certain states of affairs, like brain tumors potentially. Um, Nevertheless, I don't think it's true that you lose a meaningful distinction between someone who is responsible and someone who is not responsible once you embrace causal determinism. I mean, obviously, I'm a compatibilist, so I'm going to say that. But what you need is a theory about what makes the difference. What is the relevant difference between someone who has a brain tumor and does a mass shooting, between someone who is just an asshole, or a sadist or whatever, and does it right? Now, I should be clear. I don't think we can say that exactly what that difference is now. Our understanding of how the brain works is too limited. But I think there are general points that we can make. And one of them I think that is helpful to think about is in terms of reasons responsiveness. Is a person capable of understanding, entertaining, and at least in principle responding to the reasons available? You can cash that out in terms of counterfactuals, if you like, about if things were very slightly different, would they make a different decision? And in that case, I would say that at least in some cases, obviously it's going to depend on the specifics, but in some cases of sufficient neurological damage, the person is no longer capable of entertaining the reasons and responding appropriately in that case, just like a small child wouldn't be. They just don't understand. And in that case, I would say that they either are not responsible or at least have diminished responsibility, because we should think of this as graded. But if a person simply is a sadist, then it seems that although they will choose in a certain way, they are capable of entertaining and responding to the reasons. They just choose not to because of their motivational set. So obviously, in the particulars, that's going to get very difficult, and I'm going to acknowledge it's going to be fuzzy. But I think that a principal distinction can be made there, which allows us to preserve a notion of what an agent is, even in a causally determined world. Now,
Well,
you still may say, yeah, but we don't need that in the indefinite future. But at least for the moment, it seems like we're going to need that.
well, do you think that's going to continue? Like as we get a greater understanding of neurology, don't you think we're going to lean towards that's determined too? Like the being
Everything is determined, right? That's not
right.
compatible. Yeah. So the point I'm making is not that if something is determined, it can't be freely chosen, or it can't be subject to moral sanction. The question is what is the causal structure or the cognitive structure in which that choice is determined? Again, so a child's choice is determined under determinism just as much as an adult's one is. But the claim is that there is a relevant distinction about the way in which that choice arises, and the degree to which the person is able to cognize of alternatives and understand the implications of their actions and so forth. And that's what you can cash out in terms of reasons responsive. And if you really want, you can argue about that in terms of counterfactuals. That is, if the physical substrate was slightly different, would it be possible to have different outcomes? That's difficult to do because you've got to specify the right counterfactuals. But I mean, people are trying to work on this to make it really precise. But I think the broader point is that just because not all types of determined are equal, essentially, it kind of matters the details of how it's determined. Actually, this comes back to what we were talking about before about the Chinese room argument. Just because in some sense there are computations happening doesn't mean that there can't be understanding. It seems that to me that it depends on the nature of how that works. In the reading everything from a big book case, yeah, there's no understanding there. But in a with sufficiently complex neural apparatus with the right sort of embeddings and cognitive substrate, then plausibly you can have understanding. So I think it's sort of loosely analogous to that in the case of agents. A child or a highly impaired person is causally determined, but the way in which that causation arises or the outcome of that is such that there is no ability to be responsive to reasons or understand the consequences. And that is what is critical for determining whether someone should be held accountable or not.
And
Not
you,
the mere fact of it being determined.
and you, because my position is that I think that the transition as seeing these more determined, like rocks falling on you as immoral, seems to be a natural progression of the way morality is probably going to go in the future. And you're saying you would lose something in your position, in your perspective of what morality is, but do you think that would not, or is not, what would be a natural progression once we get to that point?
Well, that's hard to predict. Yeah, I mean, I could imagine a very different society having a very different conception of morality. I think that this is important to think about when sometimes people give objections about, well, alien societies that didn't have our conception. Or, I mean, an example that I think is more relevant is imagine that humans were a eusocial species like ants or bees, right? Almost certainly our conception of morality would be very different. We would almost certainly have much of a diminished, I mean, as we did historically, but even more than a diminished sense of the importance of an individual, because individuals would be disposable in the context of the whole colony. And I think that this seems bad to us, right? But again, I think that that's where the lack of imagination is coming in. We're kind of imagining, it's like the bee movie, right? That we're just basically people, but bees. But it wouldn't be like that. Like that's the whole point. We would be very different. And we would need to understand not human well-being, but be well-being. But I don't even know what that would mean, like, because it's questionable whether we could even be conscious with those evolutionary pressures. But whatever, you get the point I'm saying. It would be very different. And so I think that makes sense, and it could make sense in the sort of arbitrarily projections that you're talking about, that when things were sufficiently different, technologically advanced, whatever, our moral notions would be very fundamentally different. And I don't even really want to speculate about that. Or all I would say is that certainly for the foreseeable future, I think that there is value, and you can make sense of distinguishing between agents and non-agents, or the degree of agency that a being has, irrespective of whether they're causally determined. And that seems to play an important part of morality. Now, maybe there'll come a point where that isn't true. That's very hard to say. I mean, even theists have to face that question. Like, is there free will in heaven? Like, it's some people say there is, some people say there isn't, or it's not relevant in heaven. But yeah, so maybe in sort of, when the rapture happens, or when the rapture of the nerds happens, or something. I don't know. Maybe it's different then. But some philosophers or philosophically minded persons want to try to give a theory of things that would apply in like all possible worlds, or just like is universal in that sense. I've never found that to be especially interesting. I'm more interested in just trying to come up with theories that seem adequate in the world that we currently have. And insofar as morality is a social construct, it's objective, but it's also a social construct, just like language and things like that. It's going to be sensitive to cultural change. And so very substantial cultural change could well lead to a very substantial revision of the concept. I don't see that as an undermining of any particular theory that I would give currently. And I would project to other societies as well. I don't buy into the cultural relativism argument that because beings have many similarities across societies. But what you're saying is more of a transhumanist type argument. And at that point, I would say, well, maybe some of the things that we currently say wouldn't apply then.
Oh, absolutely. So, but hypothetically, we suppose that all conscious agents tended to aggregate towards one view of morality. given enough time and resources. If there was like one unifying pattern that all the different conscious agents all over the universe held to, would that be a good contender for the right or the correct objective morality?
Well, yeah, but see that becomes really difficult because well, in my opinion, at least, you run into difficulties of language, because this is a point that I've clashed with people about alien moralities as well. So any suppose we meet, I don't know, Vulcans, right? And by Vulcan I just mean some aliens, right? Um, and they're not going to speak English or any Earth language. They're going to speak Vulcan, right? So then what we have to do is translate their discourse into, say, English, and find the terms in that discourse that are as close as we can find to moral predicates, like good and bad and right and wrong and so forth. Now, if we're lucky, they may have terms that very closely map onto what we have. And then, okay, then we can just make the comparisons and see how they use them. The trouble is there's no real reason why that should happen. I'm not saying that they wouldn't have any concept of morality. They almost certainly would if they're social, but the way they talk about it and the set of words they have could be quite different. An example of this is like the term religion, right? So religion is basically a Western construct that when you try to apply it to, say, Chinese case and ask, like, is Confucianism a religion or something like that? It's sort of like, well, it sort of is and sort of isn't, right? And scholars debate about this because there just isn't really a word that does the same thing in Chinese, at least not historically. I mean, you adopt Western terms, but historically there wasn't terms that did the same thing in Chinese language as as we had terms in the West. And so plausibly it's going to be the case for very different types of species that, although they have moral practice and discourse, the translations just sort of don't match up. So what you're going to be left with is a situation where, how do we know that there's like one thing that they're what's the word, that they're tending towards,
Well,
because
couldn't
you
you?
have to sort of take part of the discourse. You might be able to do it. I'm not saying it's impossible.
Well, I
It's
mean,
just a
would you
question
even
of,
need language at that
can
point?
you
Could
make the
you?
translations appropriately?
Would you even need language? You just look at their society and see, well, how do they organize
Right.
society? Like, are they
So that actually
building
might be
it?
better. That actually might be better, but there is still the issue. So morality is still like a concept, right? So you still have to pick out what parts of society are like morally relevant. I mean, in some sense, everything is, but the fact that we drive on a certain side of the road is not really morally relevant. But that's part of how we do society, right? So this is coming back to like the divine um, command theory issue. Some parts of how we do society are much more morally salient than others, and so you're going to have to pick out those. And I don't think you can do that in a language independent way because you have to have words to pick them out. So here's what we could do. We could use our concepts of morality and apply them to the alien culture and pick out the things that we would describe as moral. But the thing is that the alien language, Vulcans, may not have a term for that. They may have like 5 terms for that, or a term that includes other things as well. And so if we ask the question, is Earth morality converging to Vulcan morality? The moral practices may in some sense converge, but the terms might not, because they may include different things. So it becomes difficult to then, like, what do you sort of, the thing is, if you just look at practice, then you can't ask, is their notion of morality converging? Because you're just looking at our notion of morality and applying it to them.
Well, I mean, that seems
So
like
I don't know that this convergence entirely works. Because you just have to, how do you pick out what parts of their practice are converging? If you do that using our moral predicates, then you haven't really determined whether their understanding of it is converging.
well, that seems like the argument for evolution. Like, if we label a duck as this spectrum of evolved animals, and then a Klingon's label duck is like 100 years before that, this is the real duck. We wouldn't be able to tell a difference because it's all just a huge spectrum. But the spectrum all goes in the same direction. The evolutionary spectrum is the same. There's an objective evolutionary spectrum there, regardless of what section of you label duck.
Yes.
So I would say that if all societies were moving towards this description of the best of all possible worlds, one where there's no involuntary imposition of will, or essentially you can't force anyone to do anything they don't want to do, that is something we should be able to observe without actually knowing anything about language, right? Like, oh, they don't kill that thing, they don't run that person over, no jails. And if they have a collection of less of these things, as long as we can understand their intentions, then we should be able to determine whether or not they are moving in that moral direction.
Yeah, I agree with that. And maybe I'm overselling the point a bit. I just think that we do need to be cautious about when we're thinking about alien societies, just sort of assuming that the terms will naturally fit between them. I'm not necessarily saying you were doing that. I think that can be an issue because their conception of morality may well not converge if they build up their conceptions quite differently. But I agree, you can look at practices and apply our conception and say that their social practices that we would describe as moral are converging, and that may be just the sense that you think is relevant here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because I think morality is an objective thing. I think it's like evolution. It's a thing. It's there, and so even if we label it with this specific word of morality, I think it is a real phenomenon that actually exists, that is consistent across all.
I don't disagree with that. It's just that I do think that there is phenomena are objective, but the labels we use, and not just the labels, but like the space that we carve up. Like there's interesting studies in carving up the color space, for example. Different languages have different numbers of basic colors that they use to carve up the space. And so I think a lot of reality is actually like that. So we have to be cautious about asking other labels and carving up. It's not that everyone agrees the labels are subjective or relative, but the carving up is also, I think, relative. So different people will carve things up differently. Like the religion example. How do you distinguish
Problem of
religion
the
from
heap.
politics? It's quite different. Yeah, it comes into that. So there may be cultures that don't make the same distinctions that we would sort of with respect to morality. That doesn't mean that they don't have morality, but it means that they just conceptualize of it differently. But yeah, I mean, so this may not be important for exactly what you're arguing, but I think that some caution is needed because sometimes I think that these issues about the conceptualization of something and the existence of something get confused. And so if you say that they would still have a moral practice, then people might think that you're saying that they would still use all of our moral language, just like the Vulcan word for it. But there may not be a Vulcan word for it, but there could still be a Vulcan practice that our words correspond to. And then, so that's what's important.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's another thing I get into a lot. It was like the problem of identity. It's like, where do you end and the next thing begin? What is the end of the sun or the edge of the earth? What is really a particle? It's a very semantic thing. But yeah, I think that but I still think you can identify objects as individual objects, even if the language that you use to label them may be vague and how you categorize them may be vague. I think there's still objects there that can be labeled independently of the language.
Yeah, well, that gets into a big question of mereology, which I don't want to get into now.
All right.
Well,
so
philosophers would like to argue about whether a lump and the statue are the same thing or a different thing, but
they're two things. Oh my God. Hilarious. So I saw your debate with Cece, Canadian Catholic. That was fun.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you watched the whole thing. The first part was really weird, but there was actually some good discussion in the second part of it. So.
Oh yeah. What part was the good part from your perspective?
Oh well, when we just actually got talking about his argument and we were working through the premises. At the first part where he was just sort of, I don't know, insulting me in an offhanded way, and I'm just like, okay, whatever. That was just weird.
Yeah. Do you have what is your response to Precept?
Oh well, Nathan and I did a long video on that. I think Precept is probably the most toxic form of apologetics. Maybe not. Well, I was going to say maybe not intrinsically, but I think it might be intrinsic. Like for some of the big, I don't remember all the names, but for some of the sort of founding fathers of this, that they seem to kind of adopt that as a strategy to just be obnoxious and rude to people.
Are you talking maybe you can original founding fathers like Bonson and Van Til, or like?
Yeah. That's what I mean. But especially some of its proponents today are just. But I mean, I also think it's a bad way to do philosophy, which is basically just whatever the other person says, ask, but why? That's just. I just think that's trivial and stupid. Not that it's always bad to ask why, right? But if that's what you're left with, it's pretty much nothing. So I don't know. I don't really see the point of it. It seems to be largely a defensive exercise for people who find value in that. In which case, okay, well, you do you kind of thing. I don't find it intellectually interesting, or I've not found it. Like none of the people that I know, like personally, because I have a lot of friends with these and stuff. None of the people that I know adopt that with me, at least. So maybe if they did, I'd find more of a reason to how to engage that. But I just haven't really come across that, or come across anyone that I'd want to engage with who uses that strategy. So I personally don't find it interesting. I don't find it intellectually interesting. I find it really toxic a lot of the time. So.
Do you feel the same way about transcendental arguments in general?
Well, I don't think transcendental arguments are very good, but this is not necessarily, because a large part of the toxicity is about the delivery and about how you engage with the discussion. So that doesn't necessarily have to be toxic. I just don't think they're good arguments.
Oh yeah, for sure. But my interest is more in the philosophical side of the argumentation, the transcendental arguments. I was
Mm.
watching a show on a different YouTube channel about transcendental arguments in general and how the cogito is considered a transcendental argument in some contexts. And in that case, I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense to me. Like, yeah, the cogito is a self-defeating argument if you reject it, because if you don't exist, you can't make the argument in the first place. So I think that would count as a valid kind of a transcendental argument. And I've been thinking about how do you differentiate valid versus invalid kinds of transcendental arguments, the vicious versus virtuous circularity thing.
I'm not. I mean, the way I think about knowledge, I don't think that there is any. I don't think knowledge needs foundations, and I don't think that there's anything that should be or can be rationally, oh, that can't be rationally questioned. So even the cogito, for example, I don't think that. I mean, I think you can rationally question the existence of selves, as the Buddhists have been doing for hundreds of years, right? Um, I suppose you can probably get to somewhere where you say, what is the phrase? There seem to be appearances. I don't remember who that's attributed to. Seems pretty hard to doubt that one. I will acknowledge that it's you can't really get around that one, but I don't think you can get very far with that. So I don't know. I just the idea that there sort of some sort of grounding or presupposition to the whole notion of rational discourse. I've just never found any of the candidates persuasive, and the idea seems kind of implausible to me that there are some things that are outside the bounds of questioning. I very much are of the strong skeptical view that everything is up for grabs and everything can and should be questioned.
What do you mean when you said that we can doubt the existence of the self? Do you mean just as an individual as opposed to like some kind of collective mind of some kind? Because from my perspective, when I say the cogito, I mean the thoughts, that those things I'm having right now, I'm going to label that as me regardless of what's causing them. Could be a Borg collective mind or whatever, it doesn't make a difference. The thoughts themselves are necessarily there and I'm going to label that as me.
Yeah, well, I don't know. That's not how I thought about the cogito. I guess people will interpret it differently. If the at that point, it's not really an argument, right? If you're saying I think, therefore I am, but the I am is just another way to describe the thoughts, then that's just saying the thoughts are. But that I don't know that that's doing a whole lot. But I mean, there are people who deny that thoughts exist, right? Illuminatists about mental, about this sort of folk psychology. I mean, there are absolutely people who deny the existence of a self as some sort of, I don't know, persistent through time entity. I think whether or not you agree with those, I think they're all rationally up for debate. So that's why I just don't see those kind of appeals as very convincing. Uh,
Well, I definitely agree with the self over time because the cogito doesn't entail a continuation of
but
time. Like you could just be a
no, but it says I think, therefore I am, right? So what is
yeah.
I? And it seems that that's perfectly capable of being unpacked and at least hypothetical, like potentially being unpacked in an eliminativist way. So we realize that this I doesn't actually refer to anything. Um, this is this is a notion in Buddhist philosophy, and Hume, I think, makes a similar point where it's like, well, there is no you. There's just all these perceptions and memories and things that come and go, but there's no you beyond that. So this I that we have is kind of empty, right? So, Hume, I think, didn't go so far as to say we should get rid of the notion of I, but um, there are definitely strands of Buddhism that do say that. Like we have to. That's part of enlightenment, right? You realize there is no self. That it's a sort of subsistent entity. That it's an illusion.
Well, that's the part I don't quite understand because to me, the self is those collection of thoughts, whether they're determined by you or just being sent to you by a computer or
Well, that's
whatever.
something like a bundle theory, which is I understand what Hume thought. But then the question is, that almost seems to be just a semantic point then, because if the self is simply the thoughts, then you're just saying, like saying I think is just saying there are thoughts, and then therefore I am is just saying there are the thoughts. So it seems then you're just saying there are the thoughts, so therefore there are the thoughts. So that to me doesn't seem like it's actually an argument for anything.
Yeah,
The way I've
I
understood
don't
the
use it as an
cogito is to
argument.
establish the existence of something beyond the mere thoughts.
I don't use it that way. I use it more as just a
Well,
descriptive. So like saying the sky is blue.
fair.
The thoughts are the thoughts. It's more just a description of there is this thing which is there, and so it's not. You don't get the knowledge from like following the premises to the conclusion. It's more just a description of some kind of direct experience. The knowledge comes from the direct experience.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, you can be illuminativist about the notion of self. You can also be illuminative about the notion of thoughts. I don't quite understand. I mean, I understand somewhat of how that's supposed to work. That um, the folk psychological notion of a thought kind of doesn't make sense, and so we need to get rid of the idea. But of course, then you could say, well, I'm not buying into all of that when I say thought or thinking. I'm just referring to, I don't know, the thing that I am. I right the thing that is consciously before something or other, that is that it's hard because it's unclear what language you can use at that point. I don't know. I guess maybe you can come up with something that works for. I just don't know what. To me, that's a very long way from what I've understood a transcendental argument is supposed to be, which is to establish some actual substantive claim that is at the foundation or can't be doubted or something like that. And to me, I just don't find any of the candidates. To me, at least, it's possible, and you can find people who do really subject that to scrutiny and doubt it, right? So I just don't think there is any such thing.
You
The
mentioned
example I gave, there seem to be appearances, is about as far as you can go, but that's so far from a transcendental argument that I just don't see it as.
well, I would say that if I believe I exist, I can't be wrong. So if I have some kind of an experience of a belief that I exist, that belief can't be wrong. If the thing, by I mean literally the experience of the belief, that thing can't not exist if I have the belief.
Well, yeah. So if a belief exists, then it exists. Yes. But what's that supposed to be an argument for? Because you can say, well, does the belief exist, or is it an illusion that a belief exists? And then you have to say, well, what do we mean? Does a belief exist? You can say, well, it's simply the thing that I think might exist. I mean, at that point, I just don't know what's being done by the argument.
Oh, usually, since I use it against precept, it's just something that can be known without presupposing a God, essentially. It's just, what is one thing you can know without God? Well, I exist. And if it's just that belief, the belief itself exists, and well, it can't not exist. God claim defeated.
Well, I'm not sure. What do they say to that?
You're presupposing logic or something.
Well, if you are to make a deduction, then it seems that that's true, but you don't seem to be making a deduction from it.
Right.
At least that's what you were saying. So I don't think that's the case. I mean, there are certainly plenty of epistemologists who say that we just have direct perceptive awareness or internal awareness of certain things. Some people take that actually quite far and say, oh, you can ground a lot of perceptual evidence this way, and even the existence of the external world. But you're making a much more restricted claim, is simply saying that your thoughts, in some sense at least, must exist because you're directly aware of them.
Yeah.
And that's, yeah, to me, that doesn't require logic. Now, I just wouldn't, to me, that's not a presupposition.
Right.
And also, yeah, I mean, I would still be inclined to say that can be subjected to doubt, although at some point, so when you subject something to critical scrutiny, you have to use words to do that. And I was like, well, what do you mean by this? And do all those things true? So you could try to get around, well, I mean, you could just basically say, no, I'm not presupposing any of that. I'm simply, there's this, I don't know, a suchness that I have direct apperceptive access to. And when I say I'm not even presupposing anything there, right? You just have to use the language. So there's a thing, right, that I have that is directly perceived or something. And I'm not making any claims whatever about it or its standing or whatever. There's simply, there's a suchness. And at that point, that's basically what I mean when I say there seem to be appearances. And yeah, okay, sure. But to me, that's so insubstantial that I just don't think it does much philosophical work. But maybe it's enough for the precepts. I don't know. I don't know exactly.
The way I use that is because you mentioned you don't think knowledge needs a grounds or some kind. I think that works as a sufficient grounds as a basis for knowledge.
Well, maybe. I don't call that a ground, but if you want to call that a ground, then sure.
All right.
Just because it doesn't seem to entail any of the other things that we think, well, like even logical propositions or the existence of a self, like it doesn't get you there. But maybe, well, it doesn't straightforwardly get you there. Maybe you can.
Yeah, I usually say that. So from this thing, I have this experience and I exist, and I can make up labels for it, and those labels can be logical labels. I am me and not me, and so I can derive logic or make it up as a language based off of these experiences. That's usually how I go about it. Thanks to Philosophoid. Thank you for the super chat. This has been an incredibly informative discussion. Props to both. Appreciate it. Let's see what else we got.
Yeah, I should probably head off soon, so I don't know if there's any questions in the chat that people wanted to throw out before I get going.
Sure. Anybody got any questions? People depend on logic and morality, from Lucky 7 Wolfen.
People depend. Not sure what that means. I mean, I think we use it all the time, so in that sense, we're dependent on it. But I mean, I think we'd exist without. I mean, I'm a nominalist, right? So I don't think that logic and things like that exist in some sort of Platonic realm. I think that they're. I mean, you could call them social constructions, although they're more than that, right? In some sense, they don't depend on very specific social institutions to come up with the idea of 1 + 1 is 2. So I think that calling it a social construct is maybe not quite right either. That's why it's hard to get the language right. But I guess when people, a different way to answer that is to ask, when people say that so-and-so depends on logic, or you have to take logic or whatever as a presupposition or grounding something, I think a good way to ask is which logic, because what we currently call logic, propositional logic, is only a bit over 100 years old. It was developed in the late 19th century. Now, of course, people had logic before that, but the exact rules and language for it wasn't the same. And there are different logics that people have developed. Like in ancient India, there were many different logics that were developed. And these days we have power-consistent logics and all sorts of things. And a lot of people say, well, that's not the real logic, or their intuitions are different. But at that point, I just say, look, these are different formalisms for describing different stuff. I think that classical logic does a very good job in many cases, but there are a lot of cases where it doesn't seem to work. The paradox of the heap is a good example of this. Like, when is it not a heap? Like, it's either a heap or it's not a heap. It just doesn't seem that it works that way. So yeah, I don't take these things as fundamental. I take them as tools for description.
Cool. Perfect One asks, how could anyone doubt the existence of their own thoughts without using their own thoughts to do the doubting?
Well, oh, geez, that's hard to answer. The reason these things are hard to answer is because to answer them, I have to use words that then may or may not presuppose certain other concepts, right? So in some sense, I agree, right? We're having this conversation, so like, I don't know, something is happening, presumably. We're having this conversation. But I think you can absolutely doubt the existence of a self, depending on what you mean by a self, right? And again, look at the bundle theory of Hume, where he asks, what is the self? We don't see a self. We just see thoughts and perceptions and things come and go. Where's the self there? Now, you could say, as sort of TJump's just been saying, well, that's kind of what I mean by self. But then, well, is it? Like, I don't know that is how we often think about the notion of a self. We could debate that, right? But so, yeah, clearly there's some substrate that is this thing that we're doing. So something must exist. There seem to be appearances, yeah. But the point is that I don't think you can get from that in any straightforward way, at least, to particular ideas of what a self is, or particular ideas of what a thought is, because those are going to have, because those words mean things beyond simply, I think therefore I am kind of context. Like, they have usages elsewhere. Like when you say I, there's the way I say I'm the same person I am now as I was when I was 10. You can't get that out of the cogito, for example, because that is a very different claim. Or this idea that people have that they're the same person that when they wake up in the morning. Well, how does that work? Or the idea that you're an immaterial soul. I mean, I don't think that, but some people think that, right? Well, how do you
Cartesian dualism?
So you got, what I'm saying is you have to be really careful about what you're bringing in with what the words mean. Yeah, there must be some substrate of what we're doing now, but whether that should be, where you should describe that by using like I or person or even thought is, I think, up for grabs, depending on how you cash out those concepts. Now, you might want to try not to cash it out and just use it in a very minimalist sense, in which case, okay, fine, but we just have to be careful about what we're doing. That's what I mean.
For sure. Enigma conjecture, James Fodor. How does William Lane Craig claim to be a nominalist?
Well, he does. I mean, I don't quite understand.
I think I've
maybe
heard that before.
What's his theory of nominalism? That's what you mean?
Probably.
So William Lane Craig spent several years writing about this in his work on divine aseity, or aseity, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. The idea that God is self-sufficient. And Craig saw or sees the existence of Platonic objects like numbers or sets or whatever as a potential threat to that, because they would sort of exist separately from God in some way. So that's why Craig is a nominalist, as I understand it. And he's written, I haven't read a lot of his work on nominalism. I don't talk about it in my book, for example, because it's not really an argument for the existence of God. I don't remember why I mentioned that in this conversation, but yes, I mean, Craig is a nominalist. And I think the basic reason is he sees anything that exists separately from God, like Platonic objects, would impinge on God's aseity. Now, plenty of theists are not nominalists and don't see that as an issue. How they talk about that, look, I don't know. That's their problem. You have to ask that. I don't know what Enigma thinks about this, but all I was saying is that Craig is a nominalist. I didn't think that would be, I don't know if that's controversial or that was just news to Enigma, but exactly how he fits it together, it's not, I don't have anything to say about that.
Marty Mad Scientist, when would a human cyborg become a robot?
Well, a cyborg is a combination of like flesh and robot, right? So, I mean, that's how I understand the term. So I guess it would become a robot when there was essentially no biological aspect left. I'm not quite sure. I mean, maybe you think that humans are robots in the sense that we're like causally determined. But I think that you can have causal determinism with agency. So I think a robot could be an agent. I don't think current robots are, because they're basically automata. But I think that hypothetically, if it was sophisticated enough, say if it replicated the brain at a close enough resolution, then it could be. I don't know if that was what the question was asking about, but
I think it is. I think that was the correct interpretation.
Right.
Grummer, what does he think of atheists like Hitchens? I think that means Hitchens. Do you know of a Hitchens?
I've not heard of Hitchens. Um, well, I'm not. I mean, Hitchens was many things. Maybe what you're referring to is Hitchens didn't really take philosophical arguments for God very seriously or really engage with that. He was more, uh, I think it's fair to say he was more engaged in rhetoric and drawing out the absurdities as well as the immoralities of particularly Christianity as it's practiced. I think that the work that he did was really valuable. I think that the fact that he didn't engage with the intellectual side of it is not so much of a problem for him. Like everyone doesn't have to do that. I don't think that was his thing. I don't think that was what he was good at. Um, but I do think it's important to do that, right? So I think that because what tended to happen is I think he debated William Lane Craig at one point. I'm pretty sure he did. And although he performed well in the sense that I think he came off well, the people who are paying, like the Craig fans will say, well, he didn't respond to any of Craig's arguments, which, he didn't really. And in that sense, they get the impression that atheists don't have anything substantive to say. Um, they just want to, poke fun and draw up problems with the Catholic Church and whatever. And so I think that there's a need for both of those things. For the Hitchens style and for, let's say, the Graham Oppie style. Well, and populist kind of in between. So I respect Hitchens a lot, which doesn't mean I agree with everything that he said. But I think that we need people who do things differently to how he did, which is not to say that there was a problem with how he did it, just that it's not the only thing that matters. Again, I don't know if that's what the question was asking about, but that's all I could think about to say.
Yeah, I think it was just your general opinion. So
Yeah.
Lucky
Oh,
Seven,
really cool, really eloquent speaker. Good to listen to.
yeah. Lucky Seven Wolfen asks, I have a question. What is his grounding for metaphysical intelligibility?
I don't really know what metaphysical intelligibility is.
I think that's a reference to the precept argument that in order for there to be intelligibility or minds to be able to process anything, there is some set of criteria that is required for that, and how do you account for those? Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to be able to answer that to anyone's satisfaction in like 30 or 60 seconds. I would say in terms of epistemology, so I lean towards coherentism, which is the idea that a belief is justified to the extent that it sort of coheres with an existing set of knowledge. And in that sense, you don't have any foundational beliefs, or at least you don't need them. That is, beliefs that are justified by themselves or not in terms of any further beliefs. So this notion that there's some sort of ultimate criteria, I kind of reject. I think basically that what we do as humans is that we have cognitive models, so some sort of mental representation of the world outside of us, well, and our own thoughts as well, and that we can assess these on the basis of their internal coherence and consistency and plausibility, things like that, which all relate to the coherence of something. And we can also assess them to the extent to which they are corresponds to the world outside. So there's a notion of like a cognitive map and then an external world, and you can sort of draw correspondences between those. This is just a correspondence theory of truth, right? So I think that that's how we go about assessing knowledge. We assess that whether it's justified on the basis of whether it coheres with our existing set of beliefs, and we assess whether it's true on the basis of its correspondence with reality. Obviously, both of those ideas of coherence and correspondence need to be unpacked. I'm not even going to try to do that here. There's a lot to say about it. I don't find that there's a need for, I don't know, a fundamental notion of metaphysical intelligibility. It just, I wouldn't say that features in the way I think about things. Granted, some people will think that you have to have such a thing. I just don't think you do.
Okay. DB says, how would you define the concept of objective existence? Can anything other than an object exist objectively? Do concepts exist?
Oh, well, it's really, that's really, people asking difficult questions. So I understand objective to mean, so a fact or truth is objective, or a proposition has a truth value objectively if the truth value is not dependent on the like subjective mental state of the person entertaining a proposition or thinking about it. So that's what I mean by objective. Now, in that sense, many things can be objective, including, say, mathematical truths, including truths about language usage, for example. They're objective in the sense that the truth of them doesn't depend on what any particular person or the person entertaining the thought thinks about them. You can be wrong about how to spell a word, for example. Now, we don't need to have any transcendental understanding of existence or objectivity to make sense of that. All you have to have are truths that are not dependent on an individual subject's mental state. Now, you can still ask a further question, yeah, but what grounds those facts if it's not a person's mental state? Well, that is what grounds anything, right? I mean, some people don't even think you need a ground of truths. They just are, right? That's maybe a brute fact or something like that, or a fundamental fact. In terms of objects, the notion of an object itself is difficult because well, we've sort of talking about this before, like the paradox of the heap and the lump and the statue. How do you determine what's an object? If I take off one atom from a statue, is it the same statue, or is it now a different object? And that seems to have the implication that there's like all of these different objects sitting on top of each other with slightly different combinations of atoms in them, which seems a bit strange. Yeah, without getting into all of that, I would just say that in addressing these questions, you have to be really careful about what you're sort of building into to the concepts that you're using. I mean, so when you ask like objective existence of objects, like what do we mean by objective? What do we mean by an object? The way I would phrase it is that what we think that we have when we make objective claims is that there's some thing that makes those claims true outside of my own personal opinion. And I don't think that that's so difficult to satisfy. In fact, most things that are true are not true because of your opinion. They're true of things outside of your opinion. Not everything. Maybe whether ice cream tastes good or not is purely, that's your opinion about how you experience it. But most things are not like that. Whether or not they're transcendent or something, or whether it's a social construct, or whether it's part of a physical world or whatever, none of those truths plausibly depend on your own personal opinion. Unless you're a solipsist, in which case, well, I don't know what to say.
Lucky Seven Wolfen asks, complete the sentence. God does not exist because.
You see, God is supposed to be a necessary being, right? So either God exists necessarily or he doesn't. So no one thinks that you can complete. Theists don't think you can complete the sentence. God exists because. God exists because of his nature, right? So I would just say
think
God
he
exists.
Says God does not exist. So he's like taking. Are you a strong atheist who says God does not exist?
You see that. That's the wrong question. The question would be, why do I think God does not exist? So I think that God does not exist, or I believe that God does not exist, because that's very different from asking in virtue of what does God not exist, right? People, this might seem nitpicky, but it is important when we're having these discussions to clarify what the person is asking. Are they asking, why does it exist, or why do I think it exists? Because those are completely different questions. So if the question is, why do I think God does not exist? The answer is because I don't think it's necessary to believe in God or to postulate God in order to account for anything that we observe in reality, or and that's why I think that you should believe in things, as if you need to postulate and to account for things. So I think that we should believe in, I don't know, quantum fields or something, because we need to postulate that for our best theories of physics. I don't think we need to postulate God for explaining anything, and therefore I don't think God exists.
Is that the same answer Oppie gives of why he labels himself as an atheist? Something like that? Something along those lines?
I think so, yes. Right, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think it's similar to what he says.
Yeah. Barry asks, are the rules of chess subjective or objective? Thank you for the super chat.
Yeah, so the rules of chess are objective, right? Now, they're a social construct. Many things are. They're not. People seem to have a notion of objective, which I think is closer to transcendent. That is somehow outside of maybe space and time, or at least outside of humanity. Now, obviously, the rules of chess are not transcendent in that way, but they're objective. If I try to move my rook in this position, just wherever I feel like it, the person will say, no, that's against the rules. Like, it's not just my opinion about wherever I want to move it. Yeah, so that's an example of something that is objective, but not in any way transcendent. Yeah, so I would say they're objective. Some people prefer the word intersubjective, but I mean, if that floats your boat, you can say that as well. But I would just say objective.
All right, and last question before we get off from Ontangelo.
Hello, Ontangelo. Directed before.
How do you account for the reality without God?
Well, actually, so that's a good question. So one thing I'll say is that questions like that, in some sense, it can be helpful or unhelpful depending on your attitude. My view is that it's important to try to understand different people's perspectives and then evaluate them as best we can in a favorable light. So we want to understand it in its strongest form. So in that sense, if the question is a genuine attempt to understand a different worldview, then that's all to the better. Now, knowing Ontangelo, I suspect it may not be, although I don't want to be too rude about that. But certainly the question can be phrased as a gotcha rather than a genuine attempt to understand. And in that sense, the question is just really unhelpful, because no one's going to be able to give like a 2-sentence answer to a question like that makes sense to someone who has a different worldview. So it's always going to sound silly and underspecified. So what I would say is that as a naturalist, sorry, exactly what was the wording of the question? So
how do you account for reality without God?
Account for reality, yes. Yeah, so as a naturalist, what I would say is I take a starting point to be our best scientific knowledge as a starting point for understanding reality. I think philosophy is contiguous with the sciences, so they should, when done well, mutually support each other. So basically, how do I understand reality? Well, start with the best sciences, which I have a podcast, Science of Everything podcast. I talk about science a lot. Start there, and then look at the question of how can we understand these ideas philosophically? Like, what is a field, for example? How do we interpret quantum mechanics? Or how do we fit the notion of free will in the universe as we understand it today? And then we can do philosophical work sort of starting from that standpoint. So I think that that's not it's not a rich answer in terms of content, but it's more of an approach. That's how I approach understanding reality. Start with the best scientific knowledge and then work there and trying to build up philosophical understandings that fit well with that.
All right, I want to be respectful of your time because you said you had to go. We got one more super chat if you got time.
Sure, yeah, one more.
All right, Jim Bob, super chat. Thank you for the super chat. If truth is conceptual and absolute, and concepts always come from a mind, and humans can't create absolute concepts, we can't assume absolute mind? ?
Okay, there's a few ifs there. Can you run that one by me again?
So, if truth is conceptual and absolute, and concepts always come from a mind, and humans can't create absolute concepts, we can't assume absolute mind? ? So I think he's asking, so there are absolute concepts. Humans can't make absolute concepts, so the only thing that could would be an absolute mind. Some kind of argument.
Well, by an absolute concept, do we just mean like
mathematical truths, I think. Logical truths.
Well, yeah, so I'm not sure why humans can't create those. I suppose you could say that maybe they can't be instantiated. So this is an example like a perfect circle. We can imagine a perfect circle, but in some sense you can't, right? You can't truly imagine the perfection down to an infinite zoom level, so to speak. We have an idea of what it means, but you can't fully imagine that, or you can't actually construct one. So maybe that's what is meant. I don't know exactly, but in that sense, I would say, well, yeah, what we have are mental approximations to these ideas. Like you don't have the idea, for example, pi, right? No one has pi in their head, right? We can calculate it to arbitrary precision, but no one has the whole pi in their head. We can understand it in terms of the ratio of the circumference and the radius of a circle, right? Or the diameter rather. We understand it in that sense, but we don't understand it in its full, like infinitely many decimals, which presumably God would, if God existed, he would have all of them in his mind, like the full infinite set of decimals of pi. So as an example there, I would say that we don't have the absoluteness of the concepts in the way the questioner seems to make in our minds. We have approximations to them which are sufficient for our purposes, right? So we understand pi well enough to be able to calculate, if we have enough computers, as many decimal places as we need and deploy it in applications. Likewise with logical rules and other sort of very abstract ideas like this. And I think that that's the fundamental difference I would have, is that I see these as abstractions, which means that there isn't a reified sort of thing out there that's like pi or that's like the logical forms or Platonic forms or something. There isn't any such thing, right? What we have are tools that we can deploy in given situations. And we may have a very precise way of using that, like pi, for example. We know it's, I don't know how many decimal places these days. We can be very precise about it, but that doesn't mean that there's some sort of reified thing that we have in our minds that's absolute or something. That's a bit vague because I'm not quite sure what absolute is meant. But I think that if you're thinking about these things that way, and then you ask, how can you have that in a finite mind? I think that probably you are going to get confused. But my claim is that we don't have those things in our minds. We have abstractions or simplifications for them, which are very useful and really adequate for any purpose you might like, except maybe unless you're trying to make a transcendental argument for the existence of God, in which case I would say, well, the ideas aren't like that. I guess the issue would be, how could you show that the ideas were like that? I don't know how you could show, because all you can ever use is our approximations of them. So I would say, why postulate there's anything more to it than that?
Awesome. James, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation. Would you mind, could you tell people where to find you if they want to, like a YouTube channel or whatever?
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find. Just Google James Fodor into YouTube or into Google. You'll find my blog, podcast. And check out my book as well if you're interested in what I have to say about William Lane Craig's arguments, Unreasonable Faith. So love to see you around my channel sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks again for coming on. I'm going to let you go, and I will see you guys later.